On July 23, 1989, a man was apprehended in connection to a string of murders involving several young girls, aged 4 through 7. Occurring in Tokyo, as well as neighboring Saitama Prefecture over the course of 10 months, these murders shocked the entire country, and the murderer's apprehension made national news. And as the media picked the story up, horrific details regarding these murders were disseminated among the public, as well as the contents of the murderer's private collection of videotapes, numbering at 5,763. Among the tapes were anime and horror movies, which provided the media a convenient but erroneous motive. Here in the United States, we're no strangers to moral panics regarding violent or immoral behavior in media consumption. Video games, rock and roll and rap music, comic books, and yes, anime and horror movies have all gotten their turn as the scapegoat here in America. And so today we might look at all of this kind of rhetoric with a jaded eye and a dry laugh, but it would be a mistake to write this all off as just pearl clutching on a national level. There was a genuine feeling of fear and panic at the height of the media frenzy surrounding these crimes. Fear that was rooted in decades of the anime and manga industry growing and expanding in popularity with the youth of Japan since the 1960s. These rhetorical calls to action were made not just by the moral and political leaders of the time, but also from academics and critics alike, all standing shoulder to shoulder and offering quotes to the Japanese equivalent of the tabloids. The danger of a whole generation of youth who do not even experience the most primary two- or three-way relationship between themselves and their mother and father, and who cannot make the transition from a fantasy world of videos and manga to reality, is now extreme. It should be noted that while these murders drew national attention and painted the otaku scene in a very negative light for years afterward, it wasn't as if this kind of attitude was anything new. The origin of the term otaku, which loosely translated means house, home, or family, depending on the context and usage, has been speculated and debated on for decades. Some would point to sci-fi fans using the term in regards to novels and books in the late 1960s, while others would point to the fan convention scene in the early 1980s for a more direct example of its commonly understood meaning. Whatever the origin, the caricature and stereotype of an otaku had already been internalized by the mid-80s, having been adopted as a term of derision in magazines and other written ephemera. Though the term was first applied toward a specific kind of fan, it would morph into a more encompassing meaning, though still retaining its unflattering and pejorative usage well into the next decade and beyond.
What is an otaku?
Someone who has a hobby which is noticeable. He's a fanatic, someone who has no friends, who's dull, who stays indoors, someone closed in on themselves, and a bit suspect.
It's not surprising to see that the media caught on to a subculture and created a boogeyman to wave torches and pitchforks at, nor is it surprising that within the subculture, a particular kind of self-awareness began to sprout. While otakudom had become a known and named movement in Japanese society during the 80s, what's most interesting during this decade from an historical perspective was that this was also the time when the first generation of fans who grew up watching anime and reading manga had started to release their own official anime and manga. The 20 and 30-somethings who helped make the likes of Fist of the North Star, Dragon Ball, Akira, Urusei Yatsura, and other staples of the anime scene of the 80s grew up tuning into Osamu Tezuka's Astro Boy, or Mitsutaro Yokoyama's Gigantor, or Kazumasa Hirai's 8-Man, all making their television debuts in 1963. For the first time in anime history, the majority of penholders who were creating manga and anime grew up with manga and anime, and internalized this as a fundamental part of their childhood and therefore their identity. Couple this with a society that actively othered them for being fans, and you create an environment for hyper-conscious, self-reflecting media, as well as the occasional grandstanding. Noted author and lecturer Toshio Okada penned the formative critical book Introduction to Otakuology in 1996, following a decade plus of Japanese society casting otaku under the proverbial bus. And as such, a lot of what he says therein does come across a bit overcorrective, especially in its verbiage, going on to herald otaku as a kind of new type, to borrow the Gundam phrase, best equipped to thrive in a hyper-consumerist society. A bit grandiose of Okada, perhaps, but it has to be said that within a consumerist society, the surest sign of cultural acceptance is how quick that society is to sell the culture. Show a Marvel fan from 1995 the Marvel Cinematic Merchandise Universe and watch their head explode. But it also seems that Okada had more than just a slight personal stake in the rhetoric. Okada is more than just an author and a lecturer. He has a very important place in anime history as the first acting president and one of the major co-founders of the animation studio Gainax. A studio formed by a group of students and friends that were united by their shared love of pretty much anything geek-related, Gainax as a company is as fascinating as it is frustrating. They were responsible for some of the most important and groundbreaking anime ever released, but were also commercially short-sighted and, at times, run by charlatans. And yet, their work is still highly relevant today, as they built on a foundation of near universal themes of growing up, figuring out who you are, and finding your own way in this life. Along with just a tiny, minuscule, microscopic, quantum amount of anime culture references.
Haruko-san! Here's my weapon, it's all for you!
A Gainax anime is a proverbial hall of mirrors, reflecting and contorting the culture that both surrounds and is surrounded by it, all done in equal parts celebration and self-deprecation. Gainax, after all, are all too well aware that there is much within the culture to extol and scrutinize. But this isn't necessarily the story of Gainax. That is for another day, though they do play a principal role in this narrative. This is the story of a guy. Specifically, this guy. The one that's posing like Ultraman like the nerd he be. His name is Hideaki Anno, and in 1995, he would change anime forever. This was inevitable. Chapter 1. Retrogenesis. When you break down the life of Hideaki Anno, it's tough not to notice just how unsurprising it is. His early life reads very much like how you would expect any artist's childhood, especially an anime artist's. He was a quiet kid who spent most of his time drawing, reserved and closed in on himself, even among his friends. Periodically, though, he would draw attention to himself, acting out episodes of his favorite shows on the playground during school breaks. Feels pretty safe to say that we all knew this kid growing up. Hell, maybe we were this kid growing up. But his talent as an artist was undeniable, and his teachers encouraged him to pursue his passion, which eventually guided him to Osaka University of Arts, where he was eventually expelled for failing to pay tuition. Though the reason why he was failing to pay tuition was because he was an absolute mad lad who couldn't stop creating. If he wasn't making student films where he was portraying himself as Ultraman, because of course he did, then he was corresponding with figures in the industry, forging connections that would eventually land him animation work. He would capture the attention of one of the lead animation directors of Super Dimension Fortress Macross, Ichiro Itano, earning himself his first animation credit and role. But my favorite story of Anno's early career was how he got involved with Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli's Nausicaa. Apparently, Ghibli was short on animators and put out a wanted ad in Animage, an anime magazine that also happened to serialize the Nausicaa manga. Anno answered the ad and showed up, clearly dressed for success.
それで友人から借りた背広の上下を着て、それで裸足の足にビーチサンダルを履いてやってきました。
This could have only happened in the 80s. I know magazines haven't been culturally relevant for the last 15 years, but imagine Disney put out a wanted ad in like Wizard magazine if it were still around, asking for animators on a new Marvel project, and you decide to pimp in wearing your dad's suit and Crocs, and you score the job. That's what happened to Otto!
見た瞬間にこいつ面白いと思ったからやれって言ったの。
This guy looks like he just hiked 20 miles after losing everything in Vegas. I like the cut of his jib! That Ono and Miyazaki's relationship started on such an offbeat note is only appropriate, seeing as how the two would later form a kind of friendly, yet adversarial relationship built on mutual respect for each other's talent, but tempered with each other's eccentricities. If you want a more in-depth look at Miyazaki, as well as some other stories regarding him and Ono's relationship, check out my review of Princess Mononoke right here. It's also here, working on Macross and Nausicaa, that Ono's reputation for being an oddball, even by animator standards, started to take root. He'd sleep underneath his desk, never going home to rest or even bathe, and would just wear the exact same set of sweatshirt and pants for days on end. You would think that he would grow out of it, but according to his own wife, Moyoko Ano, he would go weeks without bathing. In 2004. Check it out. This is from Moyoko's autobiographical manga about her and Hideaki's life together as newlyweds, entitled Insufficient Direction. Here, she breaks down her husband's own physical attributes, stating pretty clearly that he's not a fan of baths. The entire manga is actually a pretty fun read and casts a very personal light on what it means to be an otaku in a committed relationship. But, more on this later. Looking toward what he would make later in his career, his most formative and telling projects would be made outside of the industry. Along with a smattering of other students and friends he would meet in college, including Toshio Okada, Ono formed Daikon Film, a progenitor of what would eventually become Gainax. It was essentially a club for the guys to get together to make little animations and fan films for school and other outside projects. Two of those projects were a couple of short animated features that premiered at Japan's science fiction convention, or as it's known when it's held in Osaka, Daikon. Premiering in 1981 and 1983, these two short films for Daikon 3 and 4 would encapsulate not only the kinds of interests that otaku had at the time, but also the interests of Gainax and Ono, for theirs are all one and the same. Letting go of the fact that nearly every frame of both short films are legally questionable from a copyright perspective, and that would be putting it charitably.
Twilight crawling through my window.
There couldn't be a more appropriate beginning for Gainax. Forged in the celebration of everything geek, both Japanese and non-Japanese, Ono and Gainax's foundation precedes it to this day. But a studio can't make its way in this world by just animating for the fan convention circuit and selling the VHS and Laserdisc at a marginal profit, as Sayaka from Eizouken can attest. So what is a startup animation studio to do but break legit, and swing for the fences with an all-out feature film? Not just a parody film, where the parody amounts to nothing more than the guys bungling around with a camera while dressed up as Shotaro Ishinomori's Kaiketsu Zubat. Not since Turkish Star Wars has the cinema ever been graced with such daring special effects. But while Okada could point to the Daikon films for prospective investors to assuage any hesitancy on giving the burgeoning studio money, it has to be said that Ono's involvement was necessary for Gainax going forward, because while the other members hadn't made too many waves in the industry, Ono's resume spoke for itself. So when funding was secured for Gainax's big film debut, Royal Space Force: The Wings of Oniamize, it was only natural that Ono took over animation direction. Premiering in Los Angeles in 1987, Royal Space Force had been warmly received by critics and audiences alike, even garnering praise from high-profile industry members like Mamoru Oshii and Miyazaki. But it failed to break a profit at the box office. It would make its money back in the home video market, but that initial financial failure would soon become a familiar tune for Gainax. Gainax was able to course correct with successful returns with their first OVA release, Gunbuster, in 1988, while also finding high-profile work producing Nadia, The Secret of Blue Water, premiering in 1990. However, any attempts to revisit Royal Space Force for a potential sequel were met with disinterest. Entitled Uru in Blue, the proposed sequel spent over a year in development hell, as investors couldn't ignore the first film's box office returns. Without much in the way of meaningful progress, the proposal was officially shelved in July of 1993. Adding insult to injury was the fact that despite Nadia being a successful TV show, Gainax didn't own the intellectual property rights and weren't entitled to any of the profits. So when production wrapped, there went the money. Gainax ran out of funds during production of Nadia and the subsequent movie, even exhausting a 50 million yen advance that was given to them to complete the film in 1991. With hat in hand, Gainax was able to finagle a payment plan to pay back that advance over the course of a couple of years. But once Nadia wrapped, they were without any real animation project to work on, and thus, no income. It should be noted, though, that while Gainax has a long history of misappropriating and using funds, and oh child, you bet your sweet ass we'll get back to that one. Gainax were not alone in being financially strapped in the anime industry, or even the broader Japanese economy. By 1992, the bubble economy that drove Japan's financial ascent to global prominence had decidedly burst. The party was over, leaving any and every business from real estate to manufacturing and yes, the entertainment industry on their collective back foot. As it related to anime, sponsorship money evaporated, the OVA market dwindled, merchandise sat on shelves. It was a rough time for everyone involved, even the mainstays of anime. After all, this was also the period of time Bandai felt their backs against the wall and felt compelled to bet everything they had on a last-ditch effort to save the Gundam franchise, which eventually led to G Gundam. For a more in-depth look at the series, as well as its production history, check out my episode on G Gundam right here. Now, this isn't to say that anime as an industry was in any real danger of dying. The major tentpoles, Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon, were doing exactly what tentpoles are supposed to do, though theirs are squarely within the relatively stable younger demographic of teenage boys and girls, respectively. In fact, Eva wound up on TV Tokyo in the same time slot as Sailor Moon in 1995, because even in Japan and even today, anime on television is mostly the domain of kids and young teenagers, no matter if it's truly appropriate.
You want to be one with me, don't you? Be one with me in body and soul. It's something that feels really good.
As for anime targeted towards an adult demographic, the kind that made its home on the OVA market, the general attitude was more,
Well, we're boned.
if Gainax were to pick themselves up out of ruin, and if they couldn't get funding for a film, a television show had to be the answer. And it was here that Gainax tried to throw anything and everything at the wall in the hopes that it would stick, including a pitch about a sci-fi epic codenamed Olympia. And the fact that this might be the first time you've ever heard of such an anime is all you need to know about how far that project went. As for Anno, despite elevating himself within the company as their go-to director, being at the helm of both Gunbuster and Nadia, neither anime were truly his. Gunbuster, from inception, was always Okada's baby, and Nadia was being produced by Toho for NHK, a major television network in Japan. Subsequently, Anno was given relatively little creative control over the project, in spite of the thematic touches he had snuck in.
Electra seems quite nice.
Well, that's what I mean. People who act like that are always hiding something. What if you found out that they sunk your father's ship?
But I don't know that. You have to give people the benefit of the doubt, Nadia.
Throughout all of this financial strife, Anno basically mentally checked out, as he was only involved in Gainax's creative endeavors, and not its business side. For around 4 years, between 1991 and 1995, Anno withdrew himself from the industry, only taking a couple of freelance animation jobs for projects like Macross, Giant Robo, and Crimson Wolf. He was understandably disillusioned with the business and recalled that time as him being a man who ran away for 4 years. One who was simply not dead. Meanwhile, Okada had left Gainax by 1992. Some accounts suggest that Okada was asked to step down over the fallout of the Olympia project failing to launch, noting that he did little as acting president to help make it happen, which even Anno would somewhat echo years after the fact. Of course, Okada went on the record singing a different tune when asked about his departure some years later, but whatever the reason may be, Gainax was now in the hands of Hiroyuki Yamaga, the director of Royal Space Force. By the end of 1993, Gainax were basically a skeleton crew with only a handful of animators available to work on any one project. They got by on subcontracting work from other studios, a common anime industry practice then and now, doing in-between animation for projects like Bastard and Kashan Robot Hunter. They also helped make ends meet by releasing resin model kits for hobbyists, and did manage to score a legitimate hit with Princess Maker, a social simulation game where you basically act as a guardian and mentor to a young girl. Still, it only allowed Gainax to tread water, and there was still that pesky 50 million yen sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. By all outward appearances, Gainax was facing an ignominious and unspectacular end, and Anno didn't seem to care one way or the other. Until... As Gainax founding member and producer Yasuhiro Takeda tells it, Anno was drinking with King Records representative Toshimichi Otsuki toward the tail end of 1993, when Otsuki offered a collaboration with Anno and King Records. The offer was too good to be true. A guaranteed time slot for, as he put it, something. Anything. I can't impart upon you all just how fucking rare an opportunity this is that was just given to Anno. And this could have only come from a place of desperation. King Records was in the exact same boat as everyone else, financially speaking, and still had to restructure and reorganize years after this deal paid out. True, such business deals made over drinks at a local izakaya was the en vogue thing to do in Japan, even after the economic bubble burst. But this wasn't 1988 anymore, and Otsuki was well aware of that. Plus, to offer a guaranteed time slot with no notes as to what the hell it could be about is tantamount to writing a blank check. From a creative production standpoint, you literally could not ask for funding with less strings attached. Keep in mind, Gainax was practically dying on the vine by this point, and though they needed the work, they also had a history of not being able to do said work. Still, this was what Anno had been waiting for his entire career. And seeing as how something should come from what they tried to do with Uru and Blue, Anno took this opportunity to Gainax to see if they could salvage what they came up with for the failed proposal. It was a veritable once more unto the breach, dear friends, make the other poor bastard die for his country, who wants to live forever, today we celebrate our Independence Day Hail Mary of a project, where the stakes were nothing less than an entire company's future. From the media firestorm surrounding the 1989 murders, to the entire country's economy bottoming out, Gainax and the anime industry at large needed something to pull back the fans of old and, most importantly, make new fans. Anno even had a pretty good idea of what this mythical anime could be about. After spending years of running away from the industry and pushing people away, he came to one solid conclusion.
Don't run away! Don't run away! Don't run away! Don't run away! I'll do it. I'll be its pilot.
Chapter 2. Ripping the Band-Aid Off. Now, before we get too far, I feel like we need to get everyone on the same page, which means summarizing the story as well as clarifying a few choices I'm making moving forward. A lot of the old guard fans take issue with the recent dub of Evangelion for a multitude of reasons, and may wonder why I'm choosing the new dub for my episode, and it boils down to a few simple reasons. One, the most readily available high-definition footage for the series in America has the new dub, and I am not going to spend $175 on the special edition just so I can have the first dub produced by ADV in the mid-90s in high definition. 2. This dub was translated by Dan Kanemitsu, the in-house translator for Studio Khara. For those who don't know, Studio Khara was co-founded by Anno and is the current rights holder for Evangelion. And as such, I feel Dan's translation is as accurate to the original Japanese dub as we are likely to get, seeing as how it got Studio Khara's approval. 3. Translation is not a one-to-one science, especially between two languages that couldn't be linguistically further apart. And so while there might be overlap between certain terms, the majority of what we accept as translation is the result of generations of mutual agreement, rather than empirical results.
I failed because I couldn't figure out what was written on those test sheets.
You mean you couldn't figure out the questions that were written in Japanese?
Yep, I haven't learned all the kanji yet.
Or to put it another way, if one language has one way to count things, and another language has 500, there's just never going to be a universal translation. And for those asking why I just don't use the Japanese dub and subtitle it, I would still be using either Dan's translation or the previous translation made by ADV, and, well, look back to reason 3. While we're on the subject...
It seems that the third children is scheduled to leave Tokyo 3 tomorrow.
Yeah, that's going to need some explaining. In the original Japanese dub, a term they threw around was first, second, third, fourth, etc. children. This wasn't a translation thing, by the way, they spoke the terms in English phonetically. Whether or not this was the result of a misunderstanding of how you use sequential ordering when referring to objects in English, the fact that it was in English at all shows that this was a creative choice by Anno. Seeing as how there was no guarantee that the show would have been picked up for an English release back when it premiered in 1995, it became part of the show's in-universe terminology. ADV's Matt Greenfield apparently had to fight tooth and nail with Gainax to change the term to fit proper English, but since Kara has no obligation to kowtow to any US licensor's demands, the term stuck. It's a thing, no doubt, but it's not like it's the only thing. No matter if you put on the ADV dub, the Kara dub, or the original Japanese dub, you're still going to have to contend with the fact that the angels here are actually mistranslated. We may call them angels in the dub and in the subtitles, but the term the Japanese dub uses is shito, which doesn't mean angel. It means something closer to apostle. In fact, before the show even saw the light of day, the earliest drafts of the script used the jerry-rigged term apostolo. But seeing as how the term angel appears over and over again within the show, outside of the US's influence, this could just be distilled down to Gainax wanting to borrow the iconography and terminology of Christianity without actually engaging with it. Inaccuracy in translation is literally baked into the DNA of the show, and the sooner we all come to terms with that, as well as most nuances in translation in general, the better off we'll all be.
You're thinking in Japanese right now, aren't you? You have to be thinking in German, you idiot!
Okay then. Kuchen.
Stop!
So, with all of that being said, what exactly is Neon Genesis Evangelion even about? If you already know, or you don't care about a general plot recap, you could skip to this part of the video. In the far flung-off year of 2015, Earth had just begun to pull itself together from an apocalyptic cataclysm, colloquially known as the Second Impact. But humanity's future still hangs by a thread. Under constant assault from gigantic, monstrous beings known as angels, humanity's last and best hope lies in Japan's military.
What's going on? That was a direct hit!
No, humanity's last line is defended by the Evas, equally gigantic, armor-clad synthoids of dubious origin and backstory, overseen by the omnipresent and shady organization NERV.
We're NERV Security and Intelligence.
Yes. While the materials that comprise it are different, the signal sequencing and locations are very similar to human DNA.
Potato, potato. By the way, while we're here...
Release the special Bakelite now!
No matter which dub you watch, they still mispronounce Bakelite, the actual real-world substance that was named after an actual real-world person that actually really invented it, Leo Baekeland. God, imagine if they had to say the non-trademarked chemical name
polyoxybenzylmethylene glycol anhydride.
And if you think I'm gonna try and say that on camera, you can go screw yourself. But who in the world would be able to possess the heroic mettle and stalwart character necessary to willingly pilot these titanic weapons and put themselves in danger, all for humanity's sake?
I can't do this!
He'll do. This is Shinji Ikari, the 14-year-old son of NERV director Gendo Ikari. Apparently, Shinji and Gendo don't really get along, and they have spent the last unspecified amount of time living separately. But for reasons unbeknownst to Shinji, he has been called back to the rebuilt Tokyo because he is the perfect pilot candidate. Oh, you almost got me on that one, you sneaky little devil. Now get back in the bin where you belong. There are numerous entities and characters all driving the plot in their own way in Eva, from the angels themselves to the mysterious looming organization that seems to pull nerve strings, Sele, or Zila, as the new dub correctly pronounces. And while the angels seem to be the immediate threat, rumblings of a project called Human Instrumentality keep making themselves known, though their exact nature remains in shadows. Even rogue parties seem to stir the drink based on whims known only to them, like the double, possible triple agent Ryoji Kaji, so the actual machinations of the plot can seem quite the daunting follow, but befitting a monster of the day kind of narrative, which Eva is. It does have a pretty simple core to its story. A typical episode will center on Shinji and his many relationships. His strained relationship with his dad certainly takes thematic center stage in numerous episodes. Other times, episodes are about Shinji dealing with growing up under the supervision of his surrogate parent, Misato Katsuragi, as well as growing up around his peers and his comrades, the aloof Rei Ayanami and the bratty Asuka Langley Soryu. As the show goes on, Shinji's mental health fluctuates wildly, culminating in a mental crisis where he has to learn to accept himself and learn that he too can be happy despite the hand he was given.
Is the Unit 1 pilot present?
Yes, sir.
I heard the news. Good work, Shinji.
In a nutshell, that's Eva. And if it seems like I'm leaving out a lot, that's because I am. Evangelion doesn't have the reputation of being one of the most talked about, most endlessly expounded upon anime of all time by being a simple story. There's quite the depth to get into, and one can easily lose themselves down a rabbit hole. Like I almost did. There's a reason this episode is as long as it is, and we will be sinking our teeth into every last morsel we can. But before we can talk about what's there in Eva, we should talk about what's not there. Or, more accurately, what's getting in our way, thematically speaking. Chapter 3. The Decluttering of Evangelion. It's no stretch to say that when Eva made its American premiere, the fandom had quite a few interesting takes on the show, and those same takes on near-endless forum threads and fan sites would give way to equally ceaseless think pieces and video essays. From the use of Christian symbolism and allegories that would be familiar to a Western audience,
what started the Second Impact, as well as the linchpin and initiator of everything since then, Adam.
to obtuse direction and scripting choices.
Eva Unit 1 is tied to your heart. There's no doubt about that.
But if you depend on the Eva, then who you are will be dictated by the Eva.
It's pretty easy to see why Evangelion was given so much American attention and focus, and also why a lot of those early takes kinda missed the mark. At the time, anime and Christianity were, for the most part, two circles that never formed a Venn diagram. Japan is aware of Christianity and its core precepts, but to make an extremely long story short, centuries of outlawing the religion and bordering up pretty much every and all foreign influence had kept the religion from actually taking a deeply minor root in the country until the late 19th century. Today, between 1.5% of Japanese people identify themselves as Christian, but a number of aspects of Christian culture do have a place in mainstream Japanese society. For instance, in 2015, over half of all weddings in Japan were held in Christian ceremonies. So the question is, if barely 1% of Japanese people are Christians, why are there so many Christian weddings? Because to a lot of Japanese people, Christianity in particular is seen more as an aesthetic alternative. Religion is a murky subject when it comes to Japan and demographics, since most people treat religion as a very personal experience and not necessarily as something to identify yourself as. As such, people in Japan can take part in religious rituals as part of their lives without it becoming anything more than that, which is how over 2/3 of the population participate in Shinto practices, but only 3% identify as Shintoists. So to us, we might look at the cross and the crucifixion specifically as symbolic of a particular story about a particular person. But to a society that comes to Christianity without the centuries of cultural absorption paired with a societal attitude that religion is a matter of personal ritual, crucifixion is mostly seen through an historical context. It's just an ancient, misunderstood, and barbaric punishment, and it's been used in Japanese pop culture for decades. This isn't to say that Anno didn't understand the cultural significance of any of this, but today it's hard to see how he, and thereby Evangelion, uses Christian iconography and terminology and not think this is all just aesthetic. Again, when this was all new to American otaku, it was pretty easy to be swept up in all of the terms and the visuals because it was familiar, but presented in a way that no one in America had seen before. But for all the plot points the show has about prophecies made in the Dead Sea Scrolls, angels attacking humanity in post-apocalyptic ruin, the anime itself doesn't really engage with these ideas in any meaningful way. Watching the original series from beginning to end, as well as the end of Evangelion, the entire franchise treats Christianity like how Marvel treats Norse mythology. Mythological shorthand to help give the setting and character structure as to who they are fighting and how they go about doing it, except even Marvel massaged in how interdimensional beings wound up being revered as ancient gods. Eva never felt the need to elaborate or even go into how physical proof of divine intervention would turn the entire religious world upside down, even in the end times. The long and short of it is that Evangelion, by and large, doesn't really care about any of this from a story or thematic perspective, and certainly not from a theological perspective. It's just mainly there for flavor. Or to be even more direct, as assistant director and Anno's right-hand man Kazuya Tsurumaki surmised, there are a lot of giant robot shows in Japan, and we did want our story to have a religious theme to help distinguish us. Because Christianity is an uncommon religion in Japan, we thought it would be mysterious. None of the staff who worked on Eva are Christians. There is no actual Christian meaning to the show, we just thought the visual symbols of Christianity looked cool. If we had known the show would get distributed in the US and Europe, we might have rethought that choice. I've quoted this many times before, and I've often gotten pushback in the form of, well, just because they didn't intend for there to be any meaning doesn't mean there isn't any meaning. And that's correct. But if we are to engage with Evangelion on its level and on its own merits, we have to concede this fact. We could spend hours, days, years on the intricacies of Abrahamic religions, but that would be willfully ignoring what the series is trying to do, all in the name of having a conversational cul-de-sac. And as far as talking about Evangelion, I cannot imagine anything that would interest me less. Speaking of empty talking points that don't lead anywhere, I'm getting really sick of the deconstructing the giant robot genre conversation.
Burdening him with the fate of humanity is a bit much, isn't it?
Yeah, but we must entrust the piloting of our Avas to 14-year-olds. We have no other choice.
We're all well aware of the insidiousness of having children pilot gigantic weapons of mass destruction if our time spent reading in middle school hadn't pounded that notion into our heads already. But even for 1995, when Eva first premiered, this observation was pretty old hat. Both the original Mobile Suit Gundam and Space Runaway Ideon, premiering in 1979 and 1980 respectively, and both being directed by Yoshiyuki Tomino, had approached this same idea and theme of childhood lost in the wake of war, albeit from different angles. And wouldn't you know it, Anno later confirmed that he took inspiration from both anime. Though the show does engage with this theme way more than it ever did with anything Christian related. Eva does make a point to illustrate that Shinji's internal struggle of finding his own happiness and learning what it means to be an adult is made harder by also having the fate of humanity rest on his shoulders, and how this burden isn't exactly relatable to his peers.
Oh, man, what I wouldn't give to get in the cockpit and pilot an Evangelion just one time.
I wouldn't if I were you. I'm sure it would worry your mother.
And the early episodes take a decidedly more intense look at how a child would internalize being a mecha pilot, as Shinji is shown abdicating any sense of agency and reducing himself to a tool.
Center on target and pull. Trigger. Center on target and pull. Trigger. Center on target and pull. Trigger.
But it's not as if the source of all of Shinji's problems lie in the fact that he is an Eva pilot, and as Evangelion continues, Shinji's struggle becomes more and more internalized, and it becomes clear that his problems extend far beyond having to don a plug suit, as much as it has become a constant in his life. It'd be one thing if Shinji started out wanting to be an Eva pilot, but then over the course of the series he learns the harsh reality of what that actually entails. But no, he was against it from the very start.
Get in the Eva.
No, I can't. Besides, I just got here.
So by the time he actually learns firsthand what being an Eva pilot means, he doesn't really learn anything other than, yeah, I was right. This sucks.
The fourth children is...
Toji.
Shinji? Shinji?
To look at Eva as a deconstruction of the giant robot genre as much as it shares with its forebearers is just a bit too short-sighted for me to give it much more than a passing acknowledgement. It just doesn't really provide any kind of meaningful insight into Shinji's character, and doesn't really factor into Asuka or Rei's character at all. What's worse, this kind of critical lens is systemic of what ultimately led so many people to turn on the series and miss the central thesis of the show.
It may feel like it makes life easier for you to just play along with whatever other people say, but thoughtlessly piloting an Eva like that will get you killed.
So what? Not the point.
Deconstruction narratives have a place, certainly, but being the reactionary device they are, as it is impossible to deconstruct what hasn't been constructed yet, it's too easy for them to belabor a point. As it pertains to giant robot anime, there was a time when the conversation about our collective relationship between us as a fandom and mecha was needed to be had and digested. And that time was ended by Gurren Lagann.
Listen, Simone, don't believe in yourself. Huh? Believe in me! Believe in the Kamina who believes in you!
Finally, I feel like there's one last topic I need to get to, and it will require me going into spoiler territory, so ye be warned from here on out. It's insinuated, not outright confirmed or even really elaborated on, mind you, but just insinuated that the Evas, or at least the Evas piloted by Shinji and Asuka, contain the souls of their mothers.
Oh, Shinji Winji, wanna call your mom? Maybe you can crawl back inside the womb.
Now, I'm going to try and put this all into context for you, but when even the Evangelion wiki uses phrases like evidence suggests that and allegedly, my work is cut out for me. The show itself never goes into detail as to the hows and the whys, more so with Asuka's mother than with Shinji's. At least Yui here does talk about how she wants to provide Shinji with a future, and somehow volunteering for what was known as the Contact Experiment would achieve this. The show never bothers with details like how did this experiment go awry, just that it had something to do with wanting to create artificial souls, and it resulted in her body being reduced to primordial soup and her soul existing in the proverbial space between spaces.
Are there any photographs of Mom?
No, none exist. This grave itself is a facade. There's no body.
I was told you threw everything away. They were right, I guess.
As for Asuka's mother, Kyoko, barely anything concrete is mentioned, and only in passing, and Asuka's resulting epiphany as to her mother's whereabouts is just jarring.
Mom! I understand now. The meaning of the AT field. You were protecting me!
Okay, there are a lot of problems with this plot point, not the least of which is that this realization has no lead up or wind up, it just happens. But in order to elaborate further, we're going to have to come back to this when we delve into the stronger, more resonant themes and central thesis of Evangelion, and why this just sticks in the thematic craw, as it were.
Even if the Evas are destroyed, the AT fields will protect them. Being inside an Eva is the safest place to be.
Though the writing is obtuse, and intentionally so, there are a lot of reasons to believe this wasn't the version of events that was originally written. Evangelion is, after all, built on the remains of a failed film pitch by a fly-by-night studio, so it's to be expected that not everything is as well constructed as a Rolls-Royce. There's going to be some rough patches here and there, and the best anyone can do is smooth out things as best you can. But Eva's script challenges go beyond its ad hoc beginnings. While production began in late 1993 and into 1994, all before the series premiered in October of 1995, some outside events occurred that helped shape the script. On March 20th, 1995, a Japanese doomsday cult had released sarin gas into Tokyo's subway system, killing 13 people and injuring dozens of others. Its founder had proclaimed himself the second coming of Christ, even though the cult was founded on Buddhist scripture and claimed to want to restore quote-unquote original Buddhism. They believed that the end of the world was nigh, and only the cream of the crop among their rank and file would be spared after the nuclear bombs dropped. Though I couldn't find any direct sources that can attest to this, or at least any direct sources that was translated into English, Anno decided to pivot the story in a different direction in light of what happened. According to critic and author Hiroki Azuma, in an interview with Polish photographer and critic Christian Woznicki, Anno had intimated that he had changed the original plot as it mirrored the cult's actions and motivations too closely. He specifically feared a kind of censorship, as Azuma put it, not one mandated by the network or the Japanese government, but rather in fear of the audience writing it off as being just ripped from the headlines. Now, of course, this is Azuma speaking, not Anno, and a lot of this interview is him putting pieces together about Eva from what he gathered himself and from conversations he had with Anno, even going so far as to say that Evangelion is an intrinsic critique of the cult. This isn't gospel, but Azuma has a history and track record of being a reputable professional, and his books are just as insightful, including his magnum opus, Otaku, Japan's Database Animals, which was indispensable for my research. So while he can't be considered a direct source, there's nothing that has come to light to suggest that he was just bullshitting for this interview. But while we can look at the sarin gas attack and wonder just how much impact it had on the final product, the fact that it was changed so late in production is more than likely the reason for a lot of Evangelion's thematic writing and animation problems. The attack happened in March, and Eva premiered on television in October of the exact same year. That's barely over half a year to rewrite the scripts, re-record the audio, and reanimate the show. Or, in other words, to rebuild. Boo! It's no wonder that a lot of these themes play an aesthetic role in the anime rather than a narrative or a character role, considering how much had to be scrapped during production. Nor is it any wonder that plot points in the beginning of the series would just be completely dropped and or retconned.
It's alive. We're certain of it. Human Instrumentality Project's integral component.
Correct. The first human being. This is Adam.
Yeah, that important looking embryo thing? Never brought up again for the rest of the series, and only brought up once, and only in passing, in the end of Evangelion.
I am already one with Adam. And through the forbidden fusion of Adam and Lilith, I have the chance to be reunited once again with Yui.
Of course, not before confusing the hell out of the audience by suddenly proclaiming a gigantic white humanoid figure crucified as being Adam.
What started the second impact, as well as the linchpin and initiator of everything since then. Adam.
Adam? What's the first angel doing here?
Then all of a sudden, psych your mind, it's actually Lilith.
Must those born from Adam return back to Adam, bringing about man's doom? No, wait, this isn't Lilith?
At a certain point, you just have to pull a one-punch man.
Okay.
Though this isn't to say that if it weren't for the sarin gas attack, the production would have been smooth sailing, as there was yet another wild card that was putting everyone behind the 8-ball. Anno himself.
最終的にはあのさんがこう全部塗りつぶしていくし書き換えていくみたいなことをすることでしかなんかあのさんが満足いくものが作れてないのかもな。
Being a lead director means you can't pass on decision making to somebody else. It's a tough assignment to swallow because, by definition, it's all on you. And it's especially tough for someone like Anno, who, for the first time in his professional career, was finding out firsthand what that means and how that affects everyone else under him. In between rewriting in the wake of the attack, Anno was given a book by his friend about mental illness, and it fascinated him to the point that he changed the direction and tone of the series by the second half. Watching Evangelion from start to finish, you could practically pinpoint the moment the show takes this turn.
Who are you? Shinji Ikari. But that's me.
I am you. People have another one of themselves inside.
This kind of production that can seemingly turn on a dime at any moment, coupled together with the fact that Gainax was struggling with a skeleton crew and a tight budget, also wreaked havoc on the look of the show as well. Earlier in the series, Anno's talent for mechanical animation and detail is on full display and features some of the most impressively realized animation to ever be on Japanese television. Towards the end of the series, nearly every available shortcut in the book is used. Long shots of the characters standing idly with no need to time lip flaps, long shots of still life objects, reused animation, and distractingly obvious shots of the characters with something in the foreground blocking their mouths. It's the kind of mid-season slump in quality that we wouldn't see again until Yuri on Ice. This start, stop, restart production cycle took its toll on the animators at Gainax, as well as Tatsunoko, who was brought in to pinch hit after the two companies' working relationship formed on Kashan Robot Hunter. Even Soramaki didn't have a clue as to how this was going to end.
ちょっと絡んでた立場とすると、もう少し作品全体が明るいというかこう軽い感じの作品になるかと僕はずっと思ってたんで、学園ものとかまあ普通にラブコメとか。実際には 随分重い作品になっていった中で学園ものみたいなところもそうですねちょっと少しこう毛色の変わった感じにしていかざるを得なくなったっていうところはあります。
Shinji's absent again. So is Ayanami, but that's not surprising. School's just not important anymore.
99 times out of 100, an anime with this kind of production baggage would have just faded into irrelevance. But you only need to be lucky once. Chapter 4. Reaching Out.
Why do you pilot your Eva?
Because it's my link.
Your link? To my father?
To everyone.
Despite all of its shortcomings, Evangelion was able to capture the attention and the imagination of an entire generation and managed to do exactly what it set out to do: create more fans in otaku.
僕はエヴァオタクです。面白かったっていうか、アスカが好きだったから。
This particular footage comes from a 1999 TV special called Welcome Back for an Extracurricular Lesson, Senpai. It was a series of specials where known personalities would revisit their hometown and teach a lesson to children at their old school, and true to form, the special ends with Ano teaching children how to animate. Aside from the fantastic information and insight the special offers, this particular episode is especially heartwarming. Seeing Ano encourage children to just let their imagination run wild, how could you not smile?
これはうまい。ちゃんと空間が出て、これはいいですよ。アニメーターなれる。
But there is a particular segment within the special that I will always remember as being the perfect encapsulation of what Evangelion is all about. At the beginning of the special, Ano is demonstrably distant and matter-of-fact, even kind of oversharing his views on his work and on himself to an audience that, at best, wouldn't exactly get the connotations of his answers.
自分が作ったアニメは好きですか？
まあ好きといえば好きですけど、結構嫌いなところもあります。
嫌いなところはどんなところですか？
自分が出てるところ。
But even during an emotional trough, he connects with a child who also happens to be a huge fan of Ultraman, just like Ano was at his age.
話が合うの。
オタクの会話ですよね。
オタクの会話に。
オタクに国境と年齢はないですよね。
If you ask me, the reason why Evangelion is still around and still talked about even after over 25 years is because it managed to connect to its audience on the audience's terms. As a lifetime otaku, Ano knows the ins and outs of what makes anime, and what otaku gravitate towards when they watch anime. That Evangelion, despite its heady themes and obtuse directorial decisions,
people will thank you and praise you for your work.
Shinji, running away isn't good.
Keep it up.
Is still recognizably a giant robot show, complete with familiar character tropes and plots, is by design. It galvanizes its own themes just by existing in its own medium. And those themes, appropriately enough, revolve around connecting to people.
Due to a state of special emergency, all phone lines are currently disabled. Please try again later.
Seriously?
From the moment we are introduced to Shinji in the very first episode, to the last frame of Shinji on the beach in End of Evangelion, a constant theme of human connection, relationships, and the strain they can all find themselves under is at play. Relationships between parent and child, and how trauma is passed along like an heirloom from one generation to the next.
Are you running away again? I'm disappointed in you. I doubt I will see you again.
Yes, I hope so.
And as a scientist, I always had complete and utter respect for her. But as a woman, there was a part of me that hated her.
Being with you about being a woman, all of it just scared me to death. I had looked for someone just like my father, a man that I hated so much.
Relationships between men and women, and how romance can complicate matters even further.
Katsuragi, you can probably remove your shirt if you're too hot. There's no reason for you to be embarrassed around me.
Kissing, you know? You've never done it, right? Then let's do it.
But wait, why?
Because I'm bored, that's why.
You still can't let go of Yui. But even so, I don't care.
Or even the tumultuous nature of the relationship between friends.
I'm really sorry about punching you in the face. Now it's your turn to punch me.
I can't do that to you.
You have to. I can't live with myself if you don't.
The constant push and pull the characters feel from each other, especially with Shinji and his father and Asuka, is the heart of what drives the conflict and themes throughout the series and films, further embodied by the anime's use of hands as a visual motif. Hands are constantly being shown reaching out to save someone. Or to hurt someone.
You're nothing. There are plenty of replacements for you, Rei.
Attack and repel, invite and nurture. Hands are used as a physical metaphor of how we make ourselves vulnerable by reaching out and making connections with each other, either out of love or hate. It's a point brought into painful focus for Shinji when he spots a scar on his father's hand from the time he saved Rei.
Yes, the rest degraded, leaving it too problematic for research.
No matter. Dispose of it.
A scar that tells Shinji that his own dad probably cares more for Rei than for him.
Commander Ikari saved her. He forcibly opened the burning hatch with his bare hands to do it.
Father did that?
Though it would take until the end of Evangelion for this moment in character arc to come to its dramatically ironic conclusion.
Be my guide and help me unite with Yui once again. What?
I cannot do that for you. I am not your doll.
But as it pertains to theme, I feel like that moment in particular has more to do with Anno's interest in incomplete people. Or, as he put it, something broken or deficient comes more naturally to me. Sometimes that thing is the body, sometimes it is the mind. Throughout the entirety of the series and even into the Rebuild movies, characters are wounded and missing body parts, mirroring the missing parts of them as people that prevent them from being happy or living the life they want to live. Even the Evas themselves are constantly shown missing an arm or having an eye gouged out in battle, a point of fact that Anno has always been upfront with, even going on the record that this was probably rooted in the fact that his own dad lost his leg in an accident, and wouldn't come to terms with it until years afterward, and would exact his frustrations on Anno as a small boy in the meantime. I think he was emotionally unstable. Maybe that's why he beat and kicked me when I did something wrong. Sometimes Mother came to my rescue and ran away holding me in her arms. Father also said something very cruel to me, though I don't remember exactly what he said. It had the same connotation as what a frustrated mother might say to her unwanted child. I wish you were not here.
Shut down the synchronization between Unit 1 and the pilot.
But sir, the dummy system is still plagued with issues. And with Dr. Akagi absent,
It's still better than the current pilot!
The acrimony between the characters is palpable, with nearly everyone sharing at least one mercurial, unstable relationship. As the show is keen to point out,
have you ever heard of the hedgehog's dilemma?
Hedgehogs? Those spiky critters?
Hedgehogs have a hard time sharing their warmth with other hedgehogs. Because the closer they get, the more they just end up hurting each other.
the struggle to be close to people is the struggle between the compulsion of needing to reach out and the need to protect yourself from harm. A point made harder in Eva by the fact that everyone in their own way is, for lack of a better term, broken.
そういう自閉的な人がどうすればなんか変われるんだろうって、そういうとこだと思います。
Even the angels themselves play into this theme as adversaries, as they too are drawn to the humans in Tokyo 3 while also protecting themselves through a non-physical yet nonetheless tangible barrier called an AT field. By the by, AT field stands for Absolute Terror Field, and yeah, it's pretty lame, I must admit, but at the very least it fits within the idea of the angels actually being analogous of shapeless dread. Calling them angels imbues them with a kind of celestial, otherworldly essence, but unlike the commonly understood portrayal as messengers of hope or deliverance, or even in the more biblically accurate yet terrifying designs found in the likes of Bayonetta, angels in Evangelion are portrayed as thoughtless, unknowable, single-minded entities that have no definite form, capable of phase shifting between dimensions and without any corollary in the real world. They are real, but unreal. And if we let go of the nomenclature surrounding them and their presence in the story, it's easier to see them as something relatable. We all have these internal obstacles that keep us from connecting with each other, that keep us from being everything that we can be or achieving what we want to. These things that are within us have no definite shape, have no physical presence, but they're there all the same.
Unit 2 psychological graph is chaotic. Psychological contamination has begun.
Psychological warfare? Impossible. The angel knows what's in the human heart?
Abandonment, neglect, abuse, they're all burdens and stumbling blocks for everyone on their journey through life and prevent us from becoming everything that we can be. And in the text of Evangelion, one defeats the angels, the amorphous, daunting fear that stymies and cripples us, by piloting the Eva and getting a proverbial grip on ourselves. If one of Eva's major concerns was to be a deconstruction of the giant robot genre, then what would be the point of having Shinji be against piloting the Eva in the very first episode? If we explore this idea of the angels being metaphors for trauma, then Shinji's reticence to going in the robot would make more sense. To combat and deal with the lingering memories of what happened to you or what you did, that's a scary thought for anyone.
Do you have something to say for yourself?
Yes. I never want to pilot an Eva again. I don't want to be here anymore.
I think by now, pretty much everyone is at least familiar with the meme, "Get in the robot, Shinji." But I also think that a lot of people forget that the show wants Shinji to get in the robot too. He may be coerced by guilt or by duty, but the anime makes it plainly clear that him getting in the robot is the right path, seeing as how the anime also portrays Shinji as the kind of person who needs a kick in the ass to do what ultimately is the best thing for himself.
I'm dishonest. A coward. A sneak. And a weakling.
Come on, damn it! Stand up! Stand up!
Not to mention that the anime also drives home the fact that, just like real life, if one were to overcome these personal struggles, they have to want to do it.
If you don't want to do it, then get out of here! Forget about the Evas and about all of us! Just go back to your old life.
A lot of this can come off as a bit self-helpy, power is within you kind of prattle, if not for the fact that running alongside this theme is a strong motif of growth. To teenage Shinji and Asuka, the concept of growth starts and ends with simply not being a kid, a common touchstone for them in their conversations.
Breaching this wall will result in the death penalty. You should go to bed. Children need the extra sleep.
Both seem to want to embrace the adult world, as your prototypical teenager wants to do. And to them, that really means only one thing.
Don't breathe through your nose. It tickles.
Of course, both Shinji and Asuka are approaching this in an understandably immature way, as the anime is also keen to point out just how childish adults can be in the adult world.
You're too old to be throwing up.
Well, I'm sorry for being too old.
We're both too old for this.
Got that right.
But as Shinji, bereft of his parents in his day-to-day life, looks to Misato for guidance and advice, so too does he look for guidance in the only adult man he can talk to, Ryoji, meeting him as he is, once again, running away from his responsibilities as a pilot.
Making and growing things are great hobbies. You learn to notice things you never noticed before. Things that make you happy.
And hurtful things too, right?
It's an obvious metaphor, sure, but then again, when has Evangelion ever been accused of subtlety? Though I will say that the show framing Shinji trying to escape and run away from others by riding the train line over and over again is a bit of appreciated nuance. I like the visual metaphor of Shinji biding his time and letting himself be carried wherever the train takes him, only to wind up back at the place he started, unable to breach that veritable chasm of becoming and being. I also like the fact that the show frames the concept of growth as something you physically do by being mindful and accountable toward yourself and your responsibilities, rather than just letting the passage of time do what it will. Hell, this idea is even explored in the very setting of Evangelion, as the days are held in perpetual summer, never entering the natural cycle of autumn and winter, as if to say time itself won't get you where you want to be.
This weather will never change. Japan will never see autumn again. It's a pity.
Growth takes time, yes, but it also takes work and effort, and an onus that you have to place on yourself if you don't want to see the world move on without you. And that responsibility is intimidating, and methinks that Anno, in an attempt to help illustrate this fear, cribbed a lot from Carl Jung in that book he was given during Eva's production. Now, I just can't assume that you all know who Carl Jung is, so quick sidebar. Carl Jung was a late 19th century, early 20th century Swiss psychoanalyst who pioneered psychology in his attempts to try and empirically study and document the psyche, a method that he called analytical psychology. In his attempts to categorize and index the many, many shades of neurosis, he created several archetypes to illustrate the kinds of observable phenomena in human behavior. He labeled one of these archetypes Puer Aeternus, or eternal child in Latin, but it's more commonly known today as Peter Pan syndrome. The term evokes the image of a person who, for one reason or another, never grew up or matured, and as such might be oblivious to their immaturity, or be all too aware of it. As such, they feel like they're disconnected from others who seem to have their proverbial shit together, as we often expect adults to be able to do. Now, to be fair, the parameters Jung placed for such a person don't align perfectly with any one of the characters in Evangelion, but that feeling of disconnect and developmental inertia is a heavy theme all throughout the series, and is even turned literal in the Rebuild movies, where the children just stop aging.
If 14 years have passed, how come you haven't changed except for your eye?
The curse. The curse of the Evas.
It is no exaggeration to say that Carl Jung's work heavily influenced the characterization of the main and supporting cast, and just like every other influence of Anno's, he wears them on his sleeve. In some sense, a person is her wounds. A sapling planted beside a supportive stake that the gardener neglects to remove will grow around the stake. The stake's presence will injure the growing tree. The tree will adapt by distorting its natural shape to accommodate the stake. But the mature tree will be the shape it has taken. It cannot be cured of the injury. The injury is an intrinsic aspect of its nature.
I wish there was more I could do. But all I can do is this.
Stop it!
Please don't miss Misato.
This is also why I don't like the idea of Shinji and Asuka's mother's spirit being inside the Evas. It just kind of pisses on the shoes of this theme. I mean, spending episode after episode building up the notion of piloting Evas as being a scary but necessary action to defeat the Angels, all in the service of creating a broader theme and metaphor for growing up and taking responsibility for yourself and your happiness and exercise your agency by getting in the metaphorical womb, Shinji?
Well, you got me. By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
At best, they're two thematic ideas that just don't mix at all. It's sloppy writing, and quite frankly, the Rebuild movies were wise to bury this, and I'll leave it at that.
You'll be okay? Oh, I'm glad to hear it.
But what I find most interesting about these themes is not how they affect the characters, but rather how they are related to the audience through Anno's personal life.
アニメや映画をやることによって人と関わり続けることができる。そう思います。自分の外にあるもので表現をしたい。肥大化したエゴに対するアンチテーゼかもしれない。アニメーションってエゴの塊だと思う。
True to that sentiment, so much of Evangelion, from the characters to the setting and nearly everything in between, sprouted from Anno's past or his own eccentricities. The constant shots of power lines are obviously a visual homage to the many power lines that crisscrossed his hometown of Ube. Rei's insistence on not eating meat is right out of Anno's dietary habits.
And this time around, you're going to come with us.
I won't be joining you.
Why not?
I don't like eating meat.
子供が本気で死んでも食わんと思いますね。これ食わないと殺すと言われた時にはじゃあ死んだ方がいいと本気で思ってましたよ。肉や魚を食うぐらいなら死んだ方がいい。
Anno couldn't stop himself from putting so much of who he is and his past into Eva, both the good and not so good, and therefore found a means to connect to an audience through the anime format that arguably hasn't been equaled since. Anno is hyper-aware of his position as an otaku, and through that mindset he tried to reassure himself and his fellow otaku about the virtues of realizing their own power, that finding their own happiness in a society that has shunned them and othered them is entirely possible and even necessary. And he did this through a format that otaku would not only be familiar with, but also be willing to engage with. An anime about characters learning that they always had the power to be happy if only they were willing to live in the real world and not resort to running away, either by virtual means as with Asuka in her video games.
She won't go to school. She won't go home. She just plays video games.
Or like Shinji, who both physically and mentally runs away. That moment Anno shared with that boy was all the proof he needed that the best way to express his vision of achieving happiness was by using the shared interest he had with those who probably needed to hear and experience his vision the most. Of course, portraying such themes with a character like Shinji and such a plot like Eva's unavoidably turns this unwilling and introverted protagonist into an immensely frustrating character to have to watch, and no one knew that better than Anno.
出てくるキャラクターはみんな自閉気味ですよね。他人となんか共有するものをあまり持たないっていうんですか、ギスギスした人間関係がそのままフィルムに出てます。これにシンパシーを感じる人もいるし、逆にかなり嫌悪を感じる人もいると思いますが、まあそれは覚悟の上でも、あえてそうしてるっていうことです。
Anno wanted to connect to a particular audience, but in order to get that audience, he needed to attract as many eyeballs as he could, while also saving Gainax from bankruptcy. The most tried and true method of achieving that, at that time, was the giant robot genre. But that doesn't change the fact that, as with any other genre, a protagonist will need to engage with the story. But Anno's protagonist, by his nature and true to Anno's vision, does not for entire swaths of the series, handicapping his giant robot anime with a necessary but still unlikable lead character. No one ever said Anno likes to take the easy way out. Without the genre, with all its tenets and tropes, there is no audience for Anno to connect to, and without Shinji being Shinji, then the connection rings hollow and fails to stick. In order for Eva to be Eva, it had to have both, no matter what kind of pushback would ensue. And Anno seemed prepared for the most of it. But he couldn't prepare for the worst of it. Chapter 5. Anno's Dilemma. Because of the production snafu from the writing having to pivot away from real-life events, as well as Anno's own creative fickleness, the tone and direction of Evangelion would veer further and further away from where it started. The show still intrigued a lot of the audience, but it would also lead them down a path toward an end that they were not expecting or even really hoping for. The ending of Evangelion, the ending of the television series, mind you, is one of the most infamous moments in anime history, and even after over 25 years later, it's just buck wild to see how this managed to make broadcast.
You can change as well.
Your shape depends on what's inside your heart and what surrounds you in the world.
Episodes 25 and 26 are what happens when creative ambition meets the cold reality of deadlines, the result of which is a rough hour of experimental animation, the likes of which had never been seen before on Japanese television, or anywhere else really, and will most likely never be seen again.
How do you really feel? I don't know. I mean, both of those feelings are real.
And that's why you pilot the Eva.
And in my opinion, it's kind of a triumph. From the moment that Shinji does what he has to do, while taking forever to do it, to him wrestling with his own thoughts within his subconscious mind and emerging on the other side affirming his value and worth to himself, the last two episodes are an absolute trip. And knowing what we do about the messy and flying by the seat of their pants production, the fact that they were able to cobble anything together that not only continues its central theme, but also bring it to the unavoidable spotlight is really impressive. That, and I also must admit that I have a soft spot for anything that goes against the grain for the sake of no one else but the creator. If animation is supposed to be a lump of pure ego, as Anno put it, then I want to see something that I could never conceive of myself. And Anno delivers.
I can only be me when others are with me. One person will always be just one person, no matter what. The entire world would only be me.
But while Anno sees the potential for expression in the medium of animation, it seems he is also aware of its inherent limitations. For every surreal, particular, and otherwise esoteric creative decision Anno made throughout the series, and in these last two episodes specifically, he pairs them with a choice that only highlights the artificiality of his own work. Characters lose their cel-painted look, becoming rough sketches while exposing the fact that they themselves are just illustrations that have achieved the illusion of movement. There are repeated shots of a soundstage, complete with studio lighting, driving home the fact that the medium, creative in its endeavor, is still only a performance. Anno even shines a spotlight on the narrative mechanics and tropes that anime often operates under, portraying a reality where Evangelion is just another school-themed anime, where Asuka is the tsundere childhood friend of Shinji's, and Rei is the transfer student late for her first day and running to class with bread in her mouth. It's like Anno is trying to strip away all the distractions that come with being an anime to get right to the heart of the matter. Isolating Shinji within his own mind and having him sit on a cheap folding chair in the void might be the endearing meme of the series.
I know it's our job to help this guy and everything, but I think this guy's a lost cause.
But it's also indicative of what Anno had been trying to do all this time. Connect to the audience by removing the Evas, Angels, Nerve, Zila, and all the extraneous plot points and settings, and thus leaving only the characters to think on themselves and speak right to the viewer.
There's something in our hearts that's missing.
And we're terrified of it. We're anxious.
And that is why we are all trying to meld into one.
We're trying to fill in each other's gaps. That is the Instrumentality Project.
The last episodes were as close as Anno could get to breaking the fourth wall, but the directness is still nonetheless palpable and appropriate. It's messy, yes, and I would also argue that in the subsequent years afterward, the market left on the anime scene had subsequently been co-opted by other anime that just didn't get Eva, to the point that it feels pretty hokey in retrospect.
I have come here so I can accept you.
I don't care if you don't.
Though, trying to blame Evangelion for the likes of Virus Buster Surge is like trying to blame RoboCop for RoboCop. But regardless of its reputation or its standing in anime history, I can't help but look at the last two episodes as a minor miracle. The production obviously had to white-knuckle its way to what audiences saw in 1996, having to compromise on budget, but thankfully not on vision. This is the kind of creative boldness that Anno wanted to express at its most distilled, and though it's not the ending that was planned, it still accomplished what it needed to.
Congratulations.
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 Thanks, everyone.
Today, we have an insight to the kind of production hell the show was made in, and having that can lend a kinder and more forgiving viewing than without it. But there was no such understanding in 1996. An ending like Eva's, coming out of nowhere and casting off as many narrative ties as it did, was always going to irk people. There's just no reality where that wouldn't happen, especially given the time. That the ending was met with blowback wasn't surprising in the least. What was surprising was the level and amount of vitriol that was slung Anno's way over the burgeoning internet. Hideaki Anno might very well be one of the first targets of an online hate campaign, and the effects it had on him were tragic.
庵野秀明をどうやって殺すかを話し合うようなそういうスレッドがあってどうやったら一番こううまく僕を殺せるかっていうのがずっとこう書いてあるわけでこうやって殺したらいいこうやって殺したらいいっていうそれを見た時にもうどうでもよくなってですねなんかなもうアニメを作るとかそういうのはもういいや。
Now, I think it goes without saying that this kind of rhetoric is sadly all too common in today's internet age, but I have to imagine it was 1,000 times worse in 1996. As insufficient as online harassment and cyberstalking laws are today, they were non-existent in 1996, and that's only keeping the United States in mind. It took until 1998 for California to enact the country's first Online Harassment Act, and Japan would have to wait another 4 years for its own legislation to pass. It must have felt utterly hopeless for Anno, not just because of the hate and the fear and the threats, but because of where it was coming from. These weren't people who always hated him and his work and just wanted him to die. These were people that probably once called themselves his fans. These were the exact people he probably wanted to reach out to and connect. And this was the response he got. If Anno quit the industry that day and never returned to do anything Eva related ever again, could you blame him? Instead, barely 2 months passed since episode 26 aired that Gainax announced a new film project revolving around Eva, which wound up being Death True Squared, previously known as the first half of the now defunct double feature Death and Rebirth. The Rebirth second half being a rough edit of about 24 minutes of scenes from the yet-to-be-released The End of Evangelion. Why the sudden turnaround? And why bother with all of these confusing and ultimately unnecessary releases? Well, remember how Gainax was still on the hook for 50 million yen? Eva being the smash hit that it was allowed Gainax to pay that back in kind, and with a whole lot left over to spare. But when you've been operating on a shoestring budget for years and all of a sudden you strike oil, it can be difficult to actually know what to do with this sudden influx of money. True to form, they wound up investing a lot of that money into projects that never really panned out. But they knew they had something with Eva, And by God, they were going to wring it out for as much as it was worth, including Evangelion vinyl figurines, Evangelion model kits, Evangelion trading cards,
Neon Genesis Evangelion. Wow.
Evangelion postcards, Evangelion hip-hop themed soundtrack. What, you think I'm kidding?
Superior race, all this black and white vision. Catholic, Muslim, too many religions.
Isn't that silly and cringy? Anyway, Evangelion t-shirts, Evangelion manga, Evangelion video games for the Sega Saturn and Game Boy, Evangelion strip mahjong game. Wait, what? Yes, you heard that right. This is an officially licensed strip mahjong game featuring Gainax characters. There's even an art book that features the, quite frankly, amateurish looking art. Just when you started to think that the Kiss casket was pushing it. This is certainly an entire galaxy away from today, where Studio Khara went on record asking fans to cool it on the Eva smut, but it's not like the merch machine ever really slowed down, if the dedicated mall stores, displays, and timed water shows are any indication. Am I just a little off base thinking that this is kind of weird? Popular anime, hell, popular anything, is going to spin some merch and rake in the cash, I get that. But seeing Japan, by and large, treat Evangelion the way we in the States treat Star Wars is surreal. I mean, seeing a gigantic billion-dollar franchise with multiple movies and planned spin-offs based on a story that, at its heart, is all about... It just always struck me as odd. But being the cash cow it is, you can't really blame Gainax for wanting to mine what it could. A business is a business, after all. And seeing how the original television left quite a lot of room for improvements in animation and presentation, it makes a certain kind of sense to use their newfound money to remake it in some form. I can imagine worse uses of your funds than to pay for re-edits and new animation, but I can also think of a lot better uses of your funds too, like actually paying your staff. Yes, according to Anno himself, the staff wasn't paid for Neon Genesis Evangelion beyond the initial commission and had to renegotiate with King Records to get just some of those fat Eva profits. I can't even imagine being Anno during this time frame. You're dealing with an unprecedented wave of online hate and death threats at a time when most people weren't even on the internet. So who in the world could even relate? All the while having to twist the arm of some nameless suits just so you could see some proper returns for your work. Anno was in no shape to take any kind of directorial leadership, so taking the advice from Miyazaki, he stepped away from the industry for a while before returning for the end of Evangelion. Sources are mixed as to when production began on the film, with some saying it was during the initial broadcast run of the series, and others quote a much later date at around November of 1996. Considering that the initial theatrical premiere of The End of Evangelion was in July of 1997, I would wager that production must have started during the broadcast run, as it's just completely impractical to believe that Gainax was able to produce EOE in little over half a year. And true to that sentiment, we can see evidence in pencil tests of certain shots from the film that made its way into the coming up next segment at the end of episode 24. Though, I suspect this all stems from a differing opinion as to when a production truly begins, as End of Evangelion is a truly unique case. The film was adapted from the original scripts for episodes 25 and 26 that had to be scrapped to make the broadcast schedule, so the exact time frame is publicly unknown. Because of Anno's absence, about half of the movie was actually directed by Kazuya Tsuramaki, who was trusted enough to carry out what Anno would have wanted before he made his return. And when he did... well...
じゃあ、エレベーター使います。まあ、幸せに包まれたらこんな仕事しないですよ。
This here is some behind-the-scenes footage that was shot during the filming of a live-action segment for EOE that wound up on the cutting room floor. All throughout the feature, it's hard to shake the feeling that Anno wasn't in a good place mentally, as he was clearly making his actors uncomfortable on set and sharing way too much information. Not helping matters at all was the fact that the crew were just piling onto him on set, and all Anno could do was try and laugh it off.
壊れないな。結構なんか。いや、まあ期待外れと思いますよ。
Given what he was dealing with and his state of mental health, it's unsurprising to see just how desperately sad and angry End of Eva is. While the last 2 episodes of the series were too open-ended and obtuse to be outright optimistic, there's no mistaking that Shinji found the means to be happy and to move forward and grow. Meanwhile, End of Eva leaves very little room for optimism. Character after character meet their violent and painful end, powerless to stop the inevitable encroachment of Zila and their singular goal of human instrumentality, reducing the entirety of the human population on Earth into a swirling maelstrom of their thoughts, pasts, and emotions. Finally achieving a solid state existence, humanity now bears no distinction between individuals, for there is no individual. All is one is all. It's still amazing to me just how well-aged End of Eva is on a technical standpoint, and it still remains one of the most visually entrancing films I have ever seen.
And now I reap the seeds that I have sown. Forgive me, Shinji.
The tone of the movie is very apocalyptic, which is appropriate considering its plot and setting. But there's no denying that there's also a very mean-spirited feel to it as well. To say nothing of the film condensing all of the unanswered questions the series left about the nature of the angels and Evas in one long protracted exposition dump, as if that logic ship hadn't set sail a long time ago.
We humans came from a source of life called Lilith, which is also like Adam. That makes us the 18th angel.
There's this lingering feeling that EOE views itself and its audience with a very real sense of anger. The amount and gratuitous nature of the character deaths certainly doesn't help this feeling, nor does a certain infamous scene either. There's a lot of ways you can read the scene where Shinji pleasures himself over Asuka's unconscious body. None of them are a kind reading. There's some wiggle room for audience interpretation here, but when Shinji has, up to now, been the audience proxy, there to be the one who asks the questions that the audience might have about this fantastic world of giant robots and monsters.
Relax, Shinji. Allow the liquid to completely fill your lungs. Oxygen will transfer directly into your bloodstream. You'll get used to it.
And when Asuka has been the fan-favorite best girl character, literally designed to be reminiscent of the popular girl or the cool girl that every boy had a crush on at school,
多分僕が14歳の時にもしそばにいたらこう近寄りがたいっていうのかな可愛いんだけど一番縁のなかったタイプっていうでもなんか憧れちゃうみたいなまあ作品の中ではアイドルとしてデザインしました。
And when Shinji is chastised for living in a fantasy world, all the while the camera pans over a real live audience that was there for, presumably, death and rebirth.
What's wrong with having your own private dream?
That's not a dream. That's just a substitute for reality.
It's just very hard to not see this as an indictment on the otaku audience. The film opens on Shinji over Asuka and ends with Shinji over Asuka, choking her out and choking his, you know. These bookend scenes feel like literal bookends, there to support the row while not necessarily being a part of the row. Without them, nothing really changes in the actual plot, and yet they are there to reinforce this very grim and ugly theme of the toxic relationship that the audience shares with Eva, and therefore Anno. No wonder he sought the advice of Hayao Anime's Trash Miyazaki. Not that Gainax was tacitly encouraging and profiting off of this relationship, no siree. But if there was any kind of doubt left as to how Anno felt during this period of his life, the quick cuts of the threat, "I'll kill you, Anno," as human instrumentality fails and Lilith's head falls off her shoulders, pretty much takes them all out back behind the shed. But here's the thing. Those letters and threats were all written by the staff. These letters are not legitimate. Gainax would have been in a lot of legal trouble if that were the case. But that doesn't mean there weren't threats on Anno's life, and their presence here is very much a premeditated decision. Also, these letters from fans, they're not just hate mail. There's genuinely positive messages in there as well. Because these were written by the staff, they have an innate understanding of what Evangelion and Anno tried to accomplish, and since these flash on the screen for barely a few frames, it seems that Anno wasn't too concerned about tipping his hand. I saw Eva and now it seems like I truly recognize myself. And this feeling is because of Eva. I want to say thank you for this. Why do I say this? To explain it would take a while, but Shinji and I are alike, depressed and helpless and introverted. I remember watching Eva and seeing Shinji being worried and troubled, and I felt the same in my heart. I mean, as far as directorial intent is concerned, you can't get more direct than that. Anno tapped into a very real feeling that he and other otaku all share in Evangelion, and in doing so, he exposed a very vulnerable side to him. In a way, he was ahead of his time, recognizing the inherent limits of identifying yourself by your childhood passions, and though he was ready to examine that part of himself, too many others weren't. No matter if Anno managed to wrap this message up in a package that seemed appealing to otaku, what they wound up getting at the end was not what they wanted nor expected, and that backlash would cause Anno to reflect on his work in a decidedly more pessimistic light. That he wound up ending Evangelion by triggering the apocalypse, leaving only the faintest possibility of people coming back, is only appropriate for a movie called The End of Evangelion. Or perhaps Soramaki put it best during an interview for a pamphlet that was sold in theaters during End of Eva's run. But when all is said and done, Hideaki Anno's comments on Evangelion are that it is a message aimed at anime fans, including himself, and, of course, me too. Anno's statements certainly are true when looking at the small circle of anime fans, but stepping back and looking at the much wider circle of Japanese people in general, we may find many of the same types of problems. Don't drag the past around. Find the next thing that interests you. It's always better to let something that is finished end.
You know, don't you? All about me and my past.
Yes, it's my job to know. All that is in the past now. We shouldn't let it hang over us.
Unfortunately, 25 years later, we live in a world where nothing ends.
I mustn't run away. I mustn't run away. I mustn't run away. I mustn't run away! Fine, I'll do it. I'll be your pilot!
Nothing ever ends. Chapter 6. Love and Circumstances. I believe it's a fair statement to say that the production of End of Evangelion was a turning point for Anno's career, not just as an animator, but as a director full stop. That a lengthy live-action segment for End of Eva was ultimately cut did little to quell, or perhaps even intensified, Anno's drive to break into filmmaking. A passion one could plainly see in him, trying to observe and learn from the more experienced film crew on set.
やはりこれは見慣れない現場なのでやっぱり見学意識の方が強くですね。
But the transition between anime director and live-action director can be a perilous one, as Mamoru Oshii can tell you in my episode on Jinro, which you can watch by clicking on the link in the upper right-hand corner. Not to mention the weight of expectations of the film debut of the man who made one of the most popular anime in history couldn't have helped matters. Nevertheless, the clout Anno had gathered allowed himself the chance to explore his directorial creativity. Today we know Anno as not only the director of Evangelion, but also as the director of probably the best Godzilla movie since the very first one, as well as other blockbusters like the recent Shin Ultraman and the upcoming Shin Kamen Rider. However, the start of his live-action film career was a million miles away from tokusatsu and kaiju fare, as he made his big screen premiere with Love and Pop on January 9th, 1998. And? Alright, I'm not going to lie. It's a pretty hard movie to sit through. And the presentation doesn't really help. Films shot on video cameras don't exactly have the best reputation, not when your company includes the likes of Things, Crazy Fat Ethel 2, and Tales from the Quad Dead Zone. Granted, Anno was using a pretty high-end DV camera during Love and Pop's filming, certainly more advanced than any camera that filmed any shot-on-video film before it, and he was certainly working with a higher budget too. But it's still a digital video camera from the 90s. As a director and animator, Anno has a predilection towards shots and blocking that call attention to themselves, a practice that most likely stems from his disdain for quote-unquote ordinary shots.
普通にやったら普通のカット割りにしかならない。普通のカット割りが悪いわけじゃないんだけど、なんか手間暇かかる割に面白くない。
And one of the advantages of using a DV camera is that its compact nature allows it to be placed and angled in ways that would either be very difficult for a traditional film camera or outright impossible. And true to fact, the next to last thing you can say about Love and Pop is that the shots are boring. But the last thing you can say about Love and Pop is that the shots are subtle. Ladies and gentlemen, behold, microwave cam, bowl of soup cam, sock cam, skirt cam. Oh my god, he couponed the movie bit. This is Anno at his most raw, unfiltered, and unrestrained. The result is that Love and Pop is probably the most distinctively shot film he has ever made, but also, frankly speaking, his most self-indulgent. You could tell that Anno was still of the mindset that name-dropping geek references was all cool, as is made painfully evident whenever the film has to legally bleep out references to any Disney-owned product.
家族3人で旅行に行ったんだ。確かフロリダのワールド行ったんだけど。
And as far as the cinematography is concerned, Anno seemed preoccupied with what he could accomplish with the technology at his disposal, rather than what said shots would communicate to the audience. I've heard Love and Pop be described as cinema verite, eschewing slick Hollywood production standards and narrative in favor of trying to capture a raw cinematic truth, as it were. But I really don't believe you can rightfully call Love and Pop cinema verite, at least not in the same breath as other works like Sherman's March, for instance. Nor does it follow the commonalities set forth by neo-realist films or the dogmatic strictures of the Dogma 95 film movement, which aim to capture objective reality through the lens of a 35mm film camera and nothing else. The fact that Love and Pop is shot on a DV camera immediately disqualifies it from the Dogma 95 discussion, and the obvious non-documentary-like cinematography is in complete contradiction to classical neo-realist cinema. Likewise, the way the editing constantly calls attention to itself, the heavy use of narration and non-diegetic sound, and the utterly baffling use of CG toward the end of the film are all at odds with the ecosystem of cinema verite. If you ask me, the film has way more in common, at least compositionally speaking, with a 90s skate video. And the abusive use of fisheye lenses doesn't help.
I brought a fisheye lens and make a rap videos with a couple of friends. It goes womp womp. And all the ladies and men, they know everything is better with a fisheye lens.
Of course, these distorted shots aren't unique to Love and Pop as far as Anno's body of work is concerned, but the amount of them in Love and Pop is just plain gratuitous. Sadly, the aesthetics of the film are an unfortunate deterrent for anyone curious enough to want to see it, if the long out-of-print Kino video release wasn't deterrent enough, or the plodding, slow pace of the first half. And yet, I do feel like Love and Pop is a compelling watch, once you get to the second half at least. And that's because it continues Anno's visual and narrative themes. The film itself follows high school girl Hiromi and her group of friends who participate in a practice called Enjo Kosai, which, roughly translated, comes out to something like compensatory dating, in which older men pay young girls, often below the age of 18, for their time to go on dates. Think the girlfriend experience, if it were 1,000 times creepier. Of course, Hiromi and her friends don't see this as the predatory behavior that it is, and just see it as a means to make a quick buck and clown on desperate men. Though immaturity can be its own danger, as Hiromi comes across a beautiful topaz ring, and seeing few other courses to purchase it, she offers herself to be the company of dangerous men. Far removed from the fantastical elements of Evangelion, Love and Pop situates itself in the reality of a very uncomfortable subject, and it's downright unflinching in certain scenes. I can't very well go into the details, this is still YouTube after all, but I will say that its most graphic scene bears more than just a slight resemblance to End of Evangelion's most infamous scene, and that also just so happens to coincide with Anno's continued use of hands as a visual motif. Whereas in Evangelion, hands were used to symbolize the tumultuous relationship between people, Love and Pop uses hands to symbolize maturity and beauty. Hiromi visits a nail salon to help her get over her body image issues on the day her final exams are over. Her friend, who is obsessed with losing weight, keeps bringing up how much she wants to lose her fat fingers. Even the film opens on Hiromi staring at her hands in bed and ends the same way, reflecting on the trauma that she experienced for the sake of purchasing a ring. Ultimately, these motifs are in service to tell a coming-of-age story in a way that, quite frankly, I don't think I've ever seen before.
時の流れはいつも無理やり物事を終わらせてくれる。期末試験も終わった。1学期も終わった。幸の高校生活も終わった。
The film treats growing up as both an inevitability and as an ending of sorts. Hiromi is all too aware that her circle of friends are on the verge of going their separate ways, to live their lives and pursue their dreams. And this awareness is reflected in her chosen hobby of photography, capturing moments between her and her friends in a veritable time capsule. But where Hiromi is concerned with holding on to the present for the sake of future nostalgia, she neglects to follow her friends' interests, anxious at the thought of them saving up for their own computers or taking dance lessons. Hiromi sees where their lives are going and she's unable or unwilling to follow, and despairs at the thought of missing out and being left behind.
自分には何かが足りないと思いながら友達とはしゃぐのは難しい。何かが足りないという個人的な思いはその人を孤独にするから。
Growing up is a transitional process. You end one chapter of your life, and then you begin another. But sometimes that means ending a chapter that you've been sharing with your friends up till now. And that can leave you feeling directionless. I do appreciate that Love and Pop is mindful of these more painful aspects of high school, as well as how easy it is to fall into a toxic and dangerous scene when you feel like a time of your life is coming to an end, and you're not quite sure what you're going to do.
でもずっと友達でいたいし。
Taken from a macro perspective, there is a surprisingly large thematic overlap between Love and Pop and Evangelion. It's hard to ignore the shared mechanics, the use of internal narration to describe what characters are feeling and going through, the aforementioned use of hand symbolism, the exploration of how ill-equipped teenagers are to handle adult matters. It's just that Love and Pop took these in a more female-oriented direction. Still, I feel like it has to be said that a movie shot on video about teenage girls and the dangers of compensatory dating is a strange follow-up to Evangelion. Not to infer that anyone was expecting Love and Pop to make an Eva-sized dent in the public consciousness, few things can after all, and the film was largely well received, netting actress Asami Miwa a Best New Talent Award at the Yokohama Film Festival in 1999. For the record, Anno also won Best New Director at the exact same ceremony. That's right, Best New Director. Kind of comforting to see Japan treat animation as if it weren't real filmmaking too. But to go from mega blockbuster TV series and film about giant robots and trauma to subdued, offbeat, avant-garde art film is quite the pivot, which admittedly is very much in line with Anno's character. And it also seems very apropos of Anno to make a promo where he calls up prostitutes just to shoot the shit.
自分をまずね変えてごらん。自分を変える。何事も男だからやってみるの。はあ。頑張ってね。はい。
Honestly, this is probably the most illuminating and insightful look into the mind of Hideaki Anno that I have yet to come across.
いやそうなんだよ。やらなきゃよかったと思った仕事が一個だけあったんだけど、それもね。最終的に形になった時はね、やってよかったと本当に思ったから、やっぱね、一回終わったものを思い返るのはやっぱ厳しいですよ。
Not to mention the funniest.
映画の方って何なの？映画の方。話は一緒？ああ、映画はね、終わりを作り直してるのあれ。なんか。
It seems downright poetic that even when filming something for a separate project and remaining anonymous, Anno still couldn't remove himself from the gravitational pull of Eva. Though, at the very least, it seemed enough distance had passed that he can joke about it offhandedly. But if Anno expected his strained relationship with the anime industry to improve with time as well, he would be sorely mistaken. A third party is yet to enter our tale, the Japanese television network TV Tokyo. And their presence would definitely be felt in Hideaki Anno's next anime, His and Her Circumstances. Premiering in October of 1998, His and Her Circumstances, which was shortened to Karekano in Japan, would be a continued genre departure from Evangelion, being a romantic high school dramedy. But just like Love and Pop before it, Karekano would again overlap with Eva thematically speaking, only this time much more obviously. And I'm not talking about the fact that they're both animated.
Show me your face! Your face.
So I'm a really weird girl! I'm all show and I'm spoiled and a liar! I'm calculating and
Said really weird girl is Yukino Miyazawa, a seemingly perfect girl with perfect grades and a perfect life, though much of it is a duplicitous act to garner praise from others. Privately, she's a slob, she's petty, and otherwise conceited. So in practice, she's not really a Rule 63 Shinji, more like a toned-down Rule 63 Patrick Bateman.
I want to fit in.
But her position at the top of the class is challenged when a handsome transfer student, Soichiro Arima, starts getting better grades than her. Naturally, their relationship would start on rocky ground, but could it blossom into something else? Gee, I wonder. In broad strokes, that's pretty much what Kare Kano is about. A high school love story about two teenagers figuring out who they are and what it means to be in a relationship. And it's also probably Anno's best work. No fooling, unlike Eva, where the characters' neuroses can and do run roughshod over the immediacy of the plot, the characters' problems in Kare Kano inform the plot of each episode directly, and still fits right at home with the kind of themes that Anno has once again drawn from the well. Growing up, overcoming your past trauma, learning to be happy by your own actions and merits, and most of all, dealing with how other people view you and how your relationships can change you, both for the better and for the worse.
You know now, don't you? You can no longer go on without Miyazawa. But Miyazawa's able to go on, poor thing. And you thought you were going to be happy.
If for no other reason, the tropes and dimensions that shoujo anime like Kare Kano work in are a lot more conducive to introspective personal drama than your typical giant robot anime, even if they are made a major focal point like in Eva. I'll even go so far as to say that, as far as the genre goes, I don't think I've seen an anime do it better than Kare Kano. And think about the competition for that title! Even though I'm not a big fan of the romantic high school anime genre, I recognize that Kare Kano does what the genre typifies remarkably well. I find the characters cute, I find the writing to be incredibly insightful about the high school experience, and the show can even be downright beautiful at points. Hell, Kare Kano is even Anno's funniest work. Yeah, Anno can do comedy. In fact, I think it's the most underrepresented aspect of his work. No one ever really mentions the brief bits of comedic relief that Evangelion has, which, you know, is not totally surprising.
Sync rate 0. Not qualified to be second children. There's no reason for me to be here.
But they are prevalent all throughout the first half of the series. Like, you know that shot of Shinji getting out of the shower and freaking out about Pen Pen, and Misato moves her beer, revealing another container protecting Shinji's modesty? You know what those are? Toothpicks. Even Anno isn't above a wiener joke. In Kare Kano, the comedy takes a comparatively sharper focus, utilizing stylized caricature, slapstick, and exaggerated facial expressions to get the laughs across, and the show mostly succeeds. But to me, the funniest aspect of the show needs a little context. And this is where TV Tokyo comes into play. So, completely unrelated to what was happening with Anno and Gainax, TV Tokyo became the target of both parents and the government after the initial broadcast of the infamous episode of Pokémon Computer Warrior Porygon caused a wave of seizures, mostly among children. The exact accurate number of people directly affected by the broadcast is hazy, as quoted figures have a range with a 100-person margin of error. AP News, for instance, reported 2 figures, almost 600 for the initial broadcast, with over 100 added for those who watched the broadcast on tape. But they also quoted TV Tokyo's number at 650, which they say includes, funnily enough, people who saw the offending footage on a news broadcast. Who were the geniuses who thought that running footage that they knew caused seizures was a good idea? I bet they'd run the Ark of the Covenant opening if it existed. In the aftermath of the incident, Pokémon went on hiatus for months, and TV Tokyo tightened their restrictions on what could make broadcast. And guess who was broadcasting Kare Kano less than a year after that Pokémon episode aired? Now, it's never been outright confirmed just how much the Pokemon incident factored into what happened with Anno and Kare Kano. You know, outside of the restrictions that were in place for every anime, including Kare Kano. And the most accurate source I could find attesting to this is some admitted speculation from an old Studio Ghibli fansite's travel blog from February 1999, where the writer was given a tour of Studio Gainax. The blog was preserved on the Internet Wayback Machine, but its broken links with zero corroborating sources has me casting some serious doubt. It might have factored into it, but to what actual extent, we'll probably never know. But what we do know is that Hideaki Anno and TV Tokyo weren't the best of friends to begin with. During Evangelion's original run, Anno had to trick TV Tokyo to get the love scene between Misato and Ryoji aired on the network, telling them that it was just a massage going on off-screen. Yes, a massage. That's the ticket. Pay no attention to the open rubber. So with all of that in mind, is it any surprise that there's a running gag in the show involving sarcastic warnings to the viewer? Every episode begins with a warning to not stare so close to the TV when watching anime. And then there's the constant reminders to not try things you see in cartoons. These overly cautious warnings happen so often that it almost borders on pettiness, which only makes it funnier to me. But what wasn't funny was when TV Tokyo dropped the censorship hammer and outright banned a love scene from the 18th episode. Honestly, nothing explicit is shown, but apparently just seeing Soichiro and Yukino in bed, blushing and panting with clothes piled up on the floor, was enough to get the network riled up. For the record, this version of the episode is unavailable on the Right Stuff release that's currently in print, so the only way you can see it is if you put your computer in harm's way, but rest assured, it does exist. Overall, the scene is pretty benign, although still effective and moving in a way that very few anime ever approach. Nevertheless, TV Tokyo's insistence on cutting the scene was putting Anno in a very precarious position in the project. On top of having to deal with TV Tokyo, the original manga creator of Kare Kano, Masami Tsuda, was none too pleased with the adaptation of her work. According to Hiroyuki Yamaga, then president of Gainax, Tsuda didn't appreciate the more comedic emphasis the anime took as compared to her manga. Yamaga even went so far as to say they upset her. Though, knowing how Kare Kano ended in the manga, maybe Gainax had the right idea. So, imagine you are Hideaki Anno, and you're neck deep in production on an anime series on a shoestring budget, and the network is stonewalling you over and over again about standards and practices, and then you find out that an important love scene in the story would have to be edited out for broadcast. And this is all happening while you're butting heads with the original manga artist. What would you do?
Fuck this shit, I'm out. No thanks.
And he did! Well, at least momentarily. According to an interview he did for the recent Japanese Blu-ray release of Kare Kano, he did step away mid-production on the 14th episode due to the mounting stress from the network, while hoping that his absence would allow the staff to work through the tight deadlines without his trademark fickleness slowing them down. It should be noted that he didn't mention Tsuda in the interview, and that he didn't abandon the project like most assumed he did in rumors that persisted after the series concluded. In his absence, directorial reins were handed off to Gainax producer Hiroki Sato, who had never directed an anime before, and hasn't since. Seeing that leaving wasn't helping the staff like he thought it would, Anno about-faced and returned to help guide the series to its abrupt end. Anyone who's seen Kare Kano knows that it's one of those blue ball series that doesn't have a proper ending. And just like Evangelion before it, the cracks in the production were showing way before the ending happens. But while Eva was able to smooth over its own production cracks with well-realized but still relatively cheap shots and other such shortcuts, Kare Kano was an utterly blatant patch job. Hey, at least it's still entertaining. Toward the end of the series, as the plot was still introducing new characters, one can't help but feel that this was supposed to have gone on for another season or two. But considering the animosity between Gainax and Tsuda, that wasn't going to happen. True to that assessment, the show limped across the finish line, barely held together with vignette-driven episodes, limited animation, and recaps aplenty.
This is my life and Arima's. This is what happened during 5 months of our young lives.
If there was a perfect visual encapsulation of the feeling around Gainax during Kare Kano's production, the credit sequence of the 19th episode where the staff burns the assets used to make the episode would have to be it. And after Kare Kano wrapped, Anno would once again step away, electing instead to work outside the directorial spotlight as an animator and storyboard artist. He wouldn't direct another anime for 5 years. But remember how I said that the Kare Kano production was already on shaky ground during the whole TV Tokyo and Suda drama? Well, guess what? It's tea time. Chapter 7. The Divorce of Evangelion. In May of 1998, right smack dab in the middle of production of Kare Kano, the Japanese equivalent of the IRS, the National Tax Agency, informed the board of directors of Gainax that they were being investigated for tax fraud. According to Gainax co-founder and producer Yasuhiro Takeda, the investigation caused Gainax's accounts to be frozen off and on during the year-long process, thus putting strain on the entire Kare Kano project and explaining, well, a lot of things.
You want to be with me?
Yeah.
Now, Gainax had always been run like a fly-by-night operation, existing on a hand-to-mouth basis for much of its existence. But when Evangelion started to make buku bucks, co-president Takeshi Sawamura still ran the finances as if it were 1993. According to the Asahi Evening News, he would try to store the company's proverbial nuts for the winter by paying the animation studios for what seemed to be their contract royalties, but then withdrew from those accounts up to 90% of their bogus royalties in cash, locking it all up in safe deposit boxes while leaving them the remaining 10% for their help in laundering the money. At its final count, Sawamura hid over 1.5 billion yen from the tax authorities, or about $11.7 million in today's money. Sawamura and Gainax accountant Yoshikatsu Iwasaki were arrested for tax evasion on July 13th, 1999. So, of course, Anno had to publicly apologize for it. Yup, despite not being involved whatsoever in the tax evasion, in fact, Anno wasn't even on the board of directors at that point, he was still the most prominent figure in the company, at least within public perception. And so Anno gave a make nice mea culpa for Gainax's wrongdoings at the behest of TV Tokyo. In the aftermath of the tax scandal, Anno was put on the board of directors by acting president Yamaga, but the move was purely a political one. Yamaga knew that Gainax's future was in doubt after what Sawamura did, since it's hard to court potential financial suitors when your company has the label of tax dodger. So Yamaga insisted Anno be put on the board of directors, though in actuality all he really needed was the name, not the man. I suspect that Anno agreed to this in the spirit of helping the friends and co-workers that he had in Gainax at the time. But as the years rolled on, the situation became more and more apparent. While he was busying himself within the Gainax ecosystem, even returning to directing for the Cutie Honey anime spin-off of the film he also directed, it finally dawned on Anno to use his position on the board to make some changes he wanted to see, particularly involving raising the pay and royalties owed to his fellow animators. However, he was constantly ignored, and to add insult to injury, Anno uncovered internal documents revealing that, in his own words, salaries were heavily biased and continued to be paid to people who did little work. I remember being shocked that some of the employees who did not have a good track record were paid much higher salaries than the staff who worked on Eva. Since his position was merely ceremonial, just there to be the name on the letterhead for the sake of a few friends, Anno decided to formally leave Gainax in 2007. But that wasn't the end of their relationship. Over the ensuing years, Anno would remain in contact with Yamaga, albeit in a more strained form, until Takeda came to Anno in 2014 with rabbit-eared pockets, insisting that Gainax needed a 100 million yen loan. Seeing as how it's not exactly pocket change, Anno worked out a deal where Gainax would pay back the loan and interest-free if Anno and his new company Kara could buy back some of the materials and rights from the anime he and his employees used to work on. It was a done deal. Until Gainaxed. Years rolled by without much in the means of correspondence with either Yamaga or anyone else at Gainax, while the payments started to dry up. Surprise, surprise. After several inquiries over the state of the rights for Gunbuster, its sequel Diebuster, and Fooly Cooly, it was revealed that they had already been sold off. Worse yet, Gainax had begun to restructure itself, creating new companies and studios in an entirely shady manner. Finally, Anno had enough and decided to pursue legal action in 2016, eventually winning his case in 2017. As of 2020, no one at Gainax has contacted Anno with an explanation or an apology. All of this I just told you is contained in an open letter that Anno wrote to explain just how much distance there is between himself and Gainax. And he wrote this letter not because of the lawsuit, but because of something way more reprehensible. In 2019, former Gainax representative director Tomohiro Maki was arrested and later sentenced to 2.5 years for indecent acts toward an aspiring voice actress/model. During the reporting of the crime, several news outlets made references to Evangelion due to Gainax's past with the property, and Anno could not abide the connection being made in such a manner. Thus, he felt compelled to write about his decade-long and painful divorce from the company he helped make with people he once was able to call friends. While Anno and Gainax's relationship continued officially until 2007, I think it's pretty fair to say that, spiritually speaking, it ended back in 1999 with Kare Kano. At least, with the benefit of hindsight, it probably should have. But as he was in 1999, fresh off having to save Gainax's public face in the wake of the tax scandal, the last thing Anno wanted was to have anything to do with anime. True to that sentiment, Anno would once again pivot away to make another live-action movie, Shikijitsu, starring, of all people, Steven Seagal's actual daughter, Ayako Fujitani. I would love to be able to tell you just what kind of movie Anno made with Steven Seagal's daughter, who also just so happened to write the novella the movie was based off of. But alas, there has never been an official US release of the movie, and thus no legal means for me to watch a subtitled English version of the movie. You're not the only one disappointed. But Shikijitsu came and went, and Anno was still puttering around Gainax, occasionally getting trumped up credits like supervising director on titles like Petite Princess Yusi, recalling that time in the foreword he wrote for his wife's manga, Insufficient Direction. After Eva, there was a time when I wanted to stop being an otaku. I was sick of the stagnation of the anime industry and fans. I was filled with self-hatred back then. I was desperate. He wrote this, most likely, around 2004 or 5. A couple of years after he married his wife, Moyoko. Herself an accomplished manga artist, Moyoko and Hideaki's wedding in 2002 and resulting marriage has been the subject of a lot of public interest, seeing as how Anno had built himself a reputation as being a self-deprecating oddball. So, when Moyoko released the fictionalized but still autobiographical manga about their life together, few could pass up the chance to really dig into what being married to Hideaki Anno must be like. And it's like being married to a huge nerd. We may have gotten some semblance of just how big of a nerd Anno is in some documentaries and TV specials before, but to see him being portrayed making Kamen Rider and Ultraman references, going gaga for trains and model kits, and eating like crap, it is quite the humanizing moment. The manga is full of little moments like this, poking loving fun at Hideaki as well as Moyoko herself. And it's also quite obvious that their relationship is great for the both of them. I didn't think I would change much when I got married, but recently I feel like I'm starting to. It's not that my core otaku-ness is diluting, but more that non-otaku aspects are being added to me. An otaku, yet not an otaku. It's a different feeling I haven't had before. Hey, it's an interesting world, and I only have my wife to thank for this. You know, we have been talking about Anno, his work, and his life for, well, going on 2 hours now. And if this were your typical story, his marriage to Moyoko would be the happy ending we all would want for him. A life full of abuse, ostracizing, and isolation brought into the limelight by a landscape-altering piece of art, but then brought down by death threats, self-hatred, and finally, industry bullshit. But a light at the end of the tunnel awaits in a loving relationship with someone who not only understands him, but emboldens him to grow and overcome everything he went through, and he begins to see himself for everything he is. The music swells, the audience weeps, credits roll. But a person's life is rarely as straightforward as a Hollywood screenplay would have you believe. And there's still one important chapter that we have yet to get to. Something that Anno even alludes to here. What's amazing about my wife's manga is that she doesn't create any out from reality. Most manga these days are no more than a device to provide readers with a refuge from reality to satisfy them out there. The bigger fans they are, the more likely they'll become one with the fantasy and have difficulty accepting anything else. My wife's manga leaves a bit of energy to readers as they return to the real world. Instead of making you want to dwell in yourself, her manga makes you want to go outside and do something. It emboldens you. It's a manga for tackling reality and living among others. My wife lives like that, and I think that's why she can write like that. Her manga accomplished what I couldn't do in Eva to the end. Well, lucky for Anno, we live in a world where nothing ever ends. Chapter 8. The end is the beginning, is the end, is the beginning, is the end, is the beginning, is the end, is the beginning.
I now remember I've been here before many times and met you.
Our names are alongside each other in the Book of Life. We'll keep on meeting each other.
It would seem that 2002 was a momentous year in Anno's life. Not only did he marry his wife, but he would begin the planning stages of the Rebuild movies, which would have to be halted so he could work on his live-action adaptation of Cutie Honey that had been languishing in development hell for the last 3 years at that point. Looking at what we know and can see for ourselves, it's still difficult to determine what exactly compelled Anno to go back to Eva. Perhaps there was a feeling that what he was making at the time were variations of the same themes in Eva. Perhaps he realized that there was another way to accomplish what he sought for Evangelion. Or maybe it's both those things. Or maybe it's none of those things. What we do know is that Anno felt that the anime industry was stagnating, and while Eva was from the previous decade, he also felt that Eva could be of some importance to the young adults of the 2000s, and possibly even further down the line. In this closed, stagnant modern era, I think what is important is not to have a technical discussion, but to state one's aspirations. The teens and tweens are supposed to be the primary demographic supporting animation, but as they lose interest, I feel that there needs to be a work of animation targeted towards them. I want to be of use in some small way to the current state of animation, and that hardened my resolve to revisit this title. Of course, this was all right in the middle of Anno finding out just exactly how rotten the state of Gainax was, so if he wanted to revisit Eva, he would have to do it on his own terms. In a bit of reality imitating art, Anno would actualize his dreams himself and co-founded Studio Khara in 2006, not just as a means to produce the new Eva movies, but also as a means to produce other creative endeavors. He wanted to foster a more egalitarian environment for the animators working with him as well, where the junior employees didn't feel like they had to shut up and do whatever the senior employees told them to do, where everyone had a voice. If you want a cute look at the history of Studio Khara, check out this little animated short called The Big Turnup, done in the style of Moyoko Anno's artwork. I'll have a link in the description box below. But the prospect of remaking Eva, this time as a proposed set of 4 films, You Are Not Alone, You Cannot Advance, You Cannot Redo, and Thrice Upon a Time, was an entirely daunting ask. Of course, these days you can't go a few weeks without news hitting of a beloved anime property gets a new reboot. And yes, I am cautiously optimistic about the new Trigun. But at the time, rebooting Evangelion in 4 big-budget movies was certainly a tall order, even if the property maintained popularity with strong merchandise and DVD sales a decade after the original series' end, thanks in no small part to Evangelion-themed pachinko machines. Yes, really. And even with Anno at the directorial helm and other members of the Eva project eventually returning to complete this new proposed tetralogy, Khara was still a brand new studio, which means in order to gain capital to make these films, the powers that be would have to rely on an old standby. Product placement!
I paid for more labor than that.
You didn't pay me. You mean that can of coffee?
Hey, that can of UCC coffee paid for Unit 1's rigging, Shinji. You shut the hell up, or else all of the movies are going to look like episodes 25 and 6, capiche? Granted, the original series, as well as the end of Evangelion, had its moments of product placement too. Hello, Sega Saturn. But the blatant amount of it in the first 2 Rebuild movies borders on ridiculousness, especially in the first movie. I mean, it's good to know that even after the second impact practically wiped out all life on Earth, you can still enjoy yourself a slice from Pizza Hut, Code Geass. Then again, from the third movie on, the amount of product placement was practically decimated. But I think that had more to do with the fact that the films veered straight into post-apocalypse territory, and that's kind of a tough sell to prospective clients. Unless somehow you scored a deal with Nuka-Cola. This is all to say that the business of Eva was, and still remains, teetering on the fine line between crass and overtly crass. When you start having crossovers with Battle Royale games, you're starting to get a little too close to the dark side, if you catch my drift. But for the first time in Eva's history, I think the commercialization of Eva proved to be a detriment to the original source material, or at least it does in the first movie. On the whole, the first Rebuild movie, You Are Not Alone, follows the first 6 episodes of the TV series pretty closely. A little too closely. There are a few new scenes that weren't there in the original run, and some scenes were shifted around to appear earlier than they otherwise did, but for the most part, it's a pretty straightforward retelling, to the point where even the characters make little meta points about it.
The plan will proceed unchanged, following the script we laid out for these children 14 years ago. The story of their lives.
If we allow the angels to bring about the third impact now, the human race won't survive. Not one single soul.
I already know all this. I don't need to hear it again.
At the time of its 2007 release, the public didn't exactly know what in the world these Rebuild movies were meant to be, to the point where even the Blu-ray's pamphlet had to kind of sit the viewer down and explain that You Are Not Alone was supposed to be a retelling of the beginning of the original series, a remake, bordering on a reboot, all the while condensing the plot arc to fit the runtime, much to the detriment of the telling of the film itself, as well as providing very little and fresh narrative meat to satiate the audience. So what we got, ostensibly, was another Death True squared. That the movie featured, for its time, impressive-looking CG and new computer-assisted animation techniques does help the movie stand on its own merits, and thanks to the later movies in the tetralogy, we can contextualize the film as a necessary launching point for the Rebuild continuity. Even its dearth of anything appreciably new does kind of fit in with the overall theme of the Rebuild movies, which, again, we'll get to. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. The first Rebuild movie is just episodes 1 through 6 condensed and given a fresh coat of paint. It's Evangelion's answer to And Now for Something Completely Different. And the unfortunate fact that the film is also chock-a-block full of product placement, however necessary it might have been, just gives the overall experience the stink of a cash-in. As I said, the later films would help couch You Are Not Alone within the overall continuity. So I suppose you could say it benefits from hindsight. Perhaps more than any other film I've ever seen, now that I think about it. But if I had to judge the movie on its own, it's pretty forgettable and easily the weakest of the tetralogy. Now, thankfully, the second movie, You Cannot Advance, does more with the story to help separate itself from the original television series.
I've seen them before.
Yes, it's just like 15 years ago. The third impact is beginning.
A lot more. Not the least of which is the introduction of a new character, the almost Gundam-worthy named Mari Illustrious Machinami.
Fresh LCL. I don't even mind that it smells like the last pilot.
Unlike the majority of the cast of Eva, Mari was not expressly a creation of Anno, but rather co-director Kazuya Tsuramaki and his writing partner, Yoji Enokido. According to Tsuramaki, producer Toshimichi Otsuki, the King Records representative that gave Anno the chance to make Eva back in 1993, insisted on a new character as well as a new Eva, which he suspected was mostly for commercial purposes, and Anno agreed in the spirit of shaking up the status quo, even telling Tsuramaki, by introducing Mari, we will destroy the world of Eva, which she eventually would. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because Anno was relatively hands-off in her creation, Mari is unique among the cast, a point made obvious by the fact that she has very few mental hang-ups, and legitimately enjoys fighting angels.
I'm just happy to pilot something.
Bullshit 10 has been...
You earned it, problem child. Good luck.
This is so damn exciting.
But by the same token, she doesn't really have a lot to do in You Cannot Advance, which Tsuramaki also copped to. Her involvement in the plot places her at a distance, as a representative being sent by another branch of NERV to Japan for dubious reasons, along with Ryoji.
Still, it's a shame we have to use these kids. Do the grown-ups' dirty work.
Still, I do feel kind of bad about using these adults to get what I want.
And because of this distance, her dealings with the cast are quite minimal. The only time she ever interacts with any of the children in the second movie was when she shares one line with Rei during the final battle, and when she literally drops into Shinji's life and kind of flirts with him.
You smell good, like LCL. One of my favorite smells in the world.
Then one last time where she saves him and kicks him back into the robot. She doesn't even introduce herself to Shinji until midway into the fourth movie after teaming up with Asuka for years. As far as the rebuild movies are concerned, she's a proverbial wild card and plot device all in one, a brutal combination of necessary and messy. Her inclusion is still an interesting decision and thematically appropriate by the end of Thrice Upon a Time, but her presence is an overall uneven one. But in my mind, what makes You Cannot Advance one of the stronger rebuild movies has little to do with Mari or anything Eva related, but rather the character and setting work. For the first time, it felt like we were getting a real insight into the day-to-day life of the people of Tokyo 3, not just momentary breathers before the next inevitable angel attack. Characters go on field trips and learn about what the Earth was like before the second impact, and they're given time to interact with each other and come to their own conclusions and wants for their lives and the lives of others. The film does well to let the characters be more than just pilots, and see why living life is its own reward. Even Rei learns about her own agency and thus comes to the conclusion that she wants to help mend the fractured bonds between Shinji and Gendo.
Would it be nice to sit down for a meal with your son and the others sometime?
And it almost works.
All right then, count me in.
At the time, I think we all kind of came to an understanding that Shinji and Gendo were always going to be at odds with each other. In the 12 years between the end of Evangelion and You Cannot Advance, we've only ever experienced their relationship as a tragedy, denied even the barest sense of redemption, reconciliation, or even direct conflict, all with a single bite. The closest the series ever got to emotional closure between Shinji and Gendo, one way or the other, was the brief shot of him and Yui telling Shinji congratulations at the end of the series, which isn't the strongest ending those characters could have. But here, the audience is given a ray of hope that perhaps Gendo can come around on Shinji and actually treat him like he's his son.
You know, things are starting to look up.
And the film denies them, as well as the audience, with an angel attack.
An explosion. Matsushiro.
I put it to you that this is the best bit of dramatic writing and plotting in the entirety of the Evangelion canon. It's amazing how much the film made me realize that Shinji and Gendo's cold and distant relationship was mostly taken for granted. They share a bitter, dysfunctional relationship because they've always shared a bitter, dysfunctional relationship, and thus they always will. After all, why wouldn't they? But then the film presents the possibility that this doesn't have to be. Not when there's another chance with a whole new series of films. Even when the film gives us an inkling that this probably wasn't meant to be.
Chaos is merely a human construct. The world only knows its own natural law of harmony and order. So you're saying it's the human heart that throws the world into confusion?
It's hard not to see Gendo stopping his work to go and have a meal with Shinji and Rei as something hopeful. And then, bam! It yanks the carpet right out from under the audience. God, that is so good! Sadly, this renewed focus on Shinji and Gendo, as well as the inclusion of Mari, takes away plot time from the rest of the characters. While Asuka makes her rebuild debut in You Cannot Advance, even given a new name as Asuka Langley Shikinami, her backstory and character is never explored with as much depth as the TV series. We get some clues as to how she lived her life up until this point, and we do get some moments where she fights against her burgeoning feelings for Shinji, as well as some moments with Misato.
I was kind of starting to think that I didn't mind being around other people so much, but that is just so not me.
I don't think that's true.
You have a kind heart, Asuka.
But from here until Thrice Upon a Time, she takes a backseat to Shinji, and even Rei.
They aren't special the way we are. Nothing's changed. It's just like before.
You're still better off on your own, Asuka.
Likewise, Misato takes a step back as compared to her role in the TV series. Her past with her father, for instance, is mentioned briefly and only in passing. Ritsuko is barely even here, serving a technical role in the plot at Misato's side, a role in which she'll serve for the remainder of the rebuild movies, becoming Misato's Kozo to her Gendo. But all of these changes aren't necessarily for the worse, they're just kind of disappointing. And then there are the changes that are made for the better. My mind immediately jumps to the fact that Ryoji doesn't give Gendo Adam, but rather the key of Nebuchadnezzar. Even though they both serve the same narrative purpose and wind up having the same amount of screen time when all the movies are through, at least now we don't have the name Adam muddying the already convoluted religious allegories. I'll even admit that the rebuild movies utilized Judeo-Christian symbolism a lot more judiciously and even managed to tie some of them to the characters and their motivations. At the very least, the film doesn't have to resort to a messy retcon like the show did. Nah, the retcons would have to wait until Thrice Upon a Time. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. The film also helps downplay the role of Zila to the point that they are ejected from the plot entirely in just a couple of scenes in the third movie, which, to me, was a much-needed bit of narrative spring cleaning. Zila, as a presence in the story of Evangelion, was a vestigial factor that only served to complicate the matters of the plot. The intrigue surrounding them and their contentious relationship with NERV just felt hollow to me, not to mention perfunctory. I mean, we already have a shadowy organization with ulterior motives. Why do we need another one? Taking Zila out back behind the shed just helps keep the antagonistic focus on NERV and Gendo specifically. But the biggest change of all was the fact that the third impact was started 12 episodes early.
You forced Unit 1 to become the catalyst before they had their pieces in place. Well, Commander, say they won't take this lying down.
If the rug was pulled out with Shinji and Gendo earlier, starting third impact at this point in the story was like sneaking up behind us and crashing a pair of cymbals together. Whether this was for the best or not, though, is a question I kind of have a tough time answering. On one hand, I can understand the need to let the audience in on the fact that, from here on out, you can't expect to know what's going to happen, while simultaneously ending the film with a bang. And yet, on the other hand, a lot of the writing problems of the third and fourth movies can trace themselves back to this decision. I suppose I come down on the side of it being the better choice, but that's after having seen the entirety of the tetralogy. In 2009, we weren't afforded that perspective. All we could do is pick our jaws up from the floor and wonder what the hell is going to happen next. And we wouldn't know until the release of You Cannot Redo 3 years later. And then we still didn't know what the hell was going to happen next. If You Are Not Alone is the weakest of the tetralogy, then You Cannot Redo is the messiest. The reasons for this are numerous, with the most immediate reason being that the narrative jumps ahead 14 years and throws a lot at the audience without bothering to plug in some holes it leaves by doing so. And one of the biggest holes is right in the beginning of the movie. Asuka and Mari fetch Unit 1 and Shinji, who have both been locked inside a gigantic cross in space for the last 14 years, presumably. And Asuka and Mari are attacked by drone Evas that are there to guard it. Now keep in mind, both Unit 1 and Shinji were last seen on Earth starting the third impact in You Cannot Advance. So, who shot them up into space and why? Oh, there are plenty of fan theories as to how it got up into space and why, but the movie proper never goes into it. Now, fan theories can be kind of fun to ruminate on if they're not outwardly inviting a fight. But if we have to rely on them to explain something as basic as how a movie even starts, yeah, that's not airtight writing. In essence, the time skip forces the audience to use the lazy and uninvolved explanation of, "It must have happened off screen," and to cut some of the pedants off at the pass. No, you don't need to show every single solid second of something happening to know it happened in a movie. I'm saying, specifically, that You Cannot Redo needed to show more. Even beyond the patches in the script caused by the time skip, there are also these little bits and lines that probably made more sense in previous versions of the script, but don't add anything to the final draft. Like here, when it's hinted that Shinji here might be a clone.
Shinji Ikari. Can we call him that?
Yes. According to the physical analysis, he's a perfect match to the third child.
Of course, it's never brought up again for the rest of the movie and mentioned nowhere in Thrice Upon a Time. Glad we introduced that landmine of a plot point. Pure speculation on my part, but if I were to guess what happened here, this was supposed to be expanded on a bit more in a previous version of the script, or maybe even addressed further in Thrice Upon a Time, but between rewrites, it got lost in the shuffle.
どれぐらいできる？
いや、もう物によりけ。
今回はどれぐらいできたんですか？
いや、今回では足掛け何年になるんだ。足掛けで言うともう8年ぐらいじゃないですか。
Because, lest we forget, Anno has a terrible reputation of changing his mind at the worst possible time, being non-committal, and just electing to do everything all over again.
普通の監督さんだったらもうちょっとなんか指針があると思うんで、その OK テイクが俺たちも知らないっていうことが不安なんだよね、やると。みんなから集まったものいっぱい出してるんですけど、全然返事がもらえない。1円とかも言われなしダメとかもしね。
要するに僕の台本が全然できてないのがこれで、一から書きますよ。
できるのはゼロからです。
どうすん
いやいや、まあどうは言ってもいつものことですよ。
いつものことですよ。
そうですか。
ちょっと明確に言ってくれたら早いんだけどな。
But the pole star of all of this sloppy and ramshackle writing in You Cannot Redo is Kaoru. Rocking that disproportionate popularity to screen time ratio, Kaoru is the Boba Fett of Evangelion. Despite only appearing in one episode in the original TV series, the same episode in which he dies, the character has enjoyed the kind of staying power that only the most beloved characters enjoy, and, well, I don't get it. I suppose there's that whole Shonen Ai angle to consider, but that can't be the main reason for his popularity, let alone the only reason. I mean, he's nice. He certainly treats Shinji a whole lot better than nearly everyone else around him. But for me, as far as his presence in the TV series goes, I find him to be kind of distracting, perking up from out of nowhere as he does. Not to mention the dramatic means of his death doesn't hit as hard as it could have if he entered the story sooner. The character simply didn't resonate with me, but he did resonate with a whole lot of others, and Kara was certainly well aware of that. I suspect that the powers that be realized that the character would benefit from expanded screen time, but didn't exactly know where to put him or how. So we wound up hanging around the periphery of the plot of the first two movies.
The third one again, huh? You haven't changed. I'm looking forward to seeing you, Shinji Ikari.
But while he has a more prominent and necessary role in You Cannot Redo, his existence is marred in all of these plot contrivances and retcons. Up until now, it's been made plainly clear that Kaoru is working for Zila, but all of a sudden he's at Gendo's side and working with him for an unspecified amount of time, even though the last time we saw Kaoru, he descended from on high to lay vengeance on Gendo's rogue plan and stop the third impact.
This is it. The time has arrived, Shinji Ikari.
Oh wait! That didn't happen! Nah, it was Ryoji who sacrificed himself and stopped the third impact, according to Thrice Upon a Time, not Kaoru. I guess that whole scene was just a trick of the light, or maybe it was just the Mandela effect at work. You know, one of those mass bits of forgetfulness that somehow managed to burn itself onto my Blu-ray copy of You Cannot Advance. Science remains divided. By the by, since we're here, how obvious was it that they didn't know what to do with Ryoji after You Cannot Advance? The character just flat out disappears in You Cannot Redo, with nary a mention, and then we find out in Thrice Upon a Time that he died. But not before he had a child with Misato, apparently off-screen during You Cannot Advance. Do you see why the off-screen excuse is so lazy? Ryoji was just done dirty. In more ways than one. At least with this sloppy retcon, it doesn't run against the idea of Kaoru just suddenly switching sides to NERV, presumably for the sake of being near Shinji, but that still doesn't clear up what in the world Kaoru was doing breathing the vacuum of space as he was in the previous films. Now I know in the TV series he was an angel, and here that might be an explanation. But...
A replica can't take a Lilin's place. Its soul resides in a different place than ours.
Well, that implies that Kaoru is a Lilin, which is in-universe terminology for human beings. And last time I checked, we still need to breathe. Chances are this was a line to explain away why Rei couldn't just take Shinji's place beside Kaoru right before he becomes the 13th angel by being tricked by Gendo into cooperating with his plan. But that still doesn't explain all this. But the worst sin that You Cannot Redo commits, at least writing-wise, is that the whole film feels like nothing progresses. Shinji wakes up, is bombarded with bad news that he inadvertently started the third impact when he tried to save Rei, wound up failing, and now he's persona non grata with everyone at the newly formed Will, an organization started by Misato to stop NERV, all aboard the ship that Misato can't seem to agree on whether to pronounce it in English or German.
Wunder will execute Operation Yamato, the neutralization of Eva Unit 13. Now launch! Wunder!
He's made to wear a bomb collar and threatened to never get into an Eva, or else they'll pop his head off his shoulders to keep him from restarting another impact. But he's abducted by NERV and befriends Kaoru, and wouldn't you know it, he gets into the robot, believing by doing so he can undo the damage he caused. Of course, the title of the movie is You Cannot Redo, and he finds that out the hard way, all the while Kaoru sacrifices himself to keep Shinji alive. The new impact is stopped, and the children are lost on the surface of what remains of the Earth. The end. Is that it? By the end of the film, Shinji is at his lowest, unable to even stand up from everything he's gone through, and while that's an understandable reaction, the journey we went through to get here is guy wants to undo his mistake and doesn't. Credits. This story doesn't so much run with the baton it takes from You Cannot Advance so much as it power pads it in hopes that the fourth movie will somehow take the baton and book it. Again, it's appropriate thematically, but it belabors its point. Well, I guess at least it has a point, which I suppose keeps it from being the worst of the tetralogy, but only by the slimmest of hairs. And thus the Rebuild series would rest on this wet fart of an entry for nigh on 9 years. A combination of Ono needing time away from anime production, wanting to pursue his chance to direct a Godzilla movie, and sheltering in place like the rest of us in 2020. But after 4 years of deep production hell, the true ending of Evangelion, allegedly, was finally released in Japan on March 8th, 2021, with only one question remaining. Was it worth the wait? Yeah, it was. I don't believe there has ever been a movie quite like Thrice Upon a Time, let alone an anime film. And I don't mean that in the sense of its plot, its characters, or its animation, but rather the meta-narrative surrounding the film and franchise and how it's incorporated into the film itself. It achieved what The Matrix Resurrections tried to.
I shall now employ this ship as previously planned.
I remember this. At this point in the story, with Rei, Asuka, and Shinji stuck on Earth and away from Will, and their fight with NERV, large sections of the story centers on the children interacting with actual honest-to-God people. Despite living in the conditions of a broken planet that they do, each side character, all having aged to adulthood in the passing 14 years, seems at peace with their agrarian, down-to-earth lives. And as Shinji recuperates from the trauma he suffered throughout the films, Asuka callously hides herself from everyone else. Rei, though, takes it upon herself to interact with the townsfolk, learning about life, people, and what can be gained by going out into the world. Without a doubt, this is the most engaging the character has ever been, as the film utilizes the concept of her being a clone, unaware of social customs and interactions, to help cultivate the inherent goodness of caring about other people in Rei, and therefore the audience. Her growth as a character, and most importantly as a person, fits amazingly well within the ecosystem of the overall theme of Eva.
Why are they holding hands?
Well, it's something we do hoping we can get along.
And in her growth and understanding, she passes this kindness and happiness along to someone who truly needs to hear words of kindness and happiness, even when the specter of death looms just right behind her.
Why is everyone so kind to me?
It's because we like you. Thank you for talking to me.
In the face of her certain demise, all she wants to do is help the boy she likes. There is a clear emotional through line that had been absent in the previous Rebuild movies, carried along by the villagers through Rei right to Shinji. It's the driving force behind the character arc for him, as he pulls himself out from the depths and propels himself to do what has to be done. It's a much needed hook for the audience, especially when plot points and devices start muddling the coherency of the narrative.
The cursed ground zero of the second impact. All the vessels of the atoms are ready.
We're above the L containment field, an area that refuses all life born of original sin.
While this ship was hijacked and reverted to the Busa, the ships used the Black Moon as raw material to create unknown spears.
Flat out, I don't think Evangelion has ever been this optimistic, but what's truly remarkable is how this optimism is used as a narrative tool for character contrast. Having lived their life as they had, the people of the village show a greater sense of growth, maturity, and perspective that has eluded our three children, stuck in perpetual teenage hell and fighting inside Eva, suffering their curse, as Asuka puts it. It's no coincidence that nearly everyone who is directly involved in the conflict, whether they be Will or NERV, suffer from some kind of trauma or stunted growth that turned them antisocial and unwilling to let go of what compels them to keep fighting these past 14 years.
You're a plague! That N3I you started made our lives a living hell! I wanted to stay behind with Kaji back then.
I'm sure you did. If you weren't expecting, you might have been able to.
People might hate me, They may talk behind my back. After all, that's all I'm worth. As long as I can pilot my Eva.
Meanwhile, everyone outside of Will and Nerve just continue to live their lives and be as happy as the situation allows them to be. Their lives are certainly not easy, robbed of the creature comforts that we have grown accustomed to, but they force themselves to adapt and help each other. And by doing so, they find ways to be content, passing down what they've learned to the pilots, both the practical and the emotional. And what makes this turn so impacting isn't just that we've known these characters from the previous movies, save for the third movie where they're completely absent. It's that we also have an entire canon we can reference as to what these characters were like and how they affected the story. A canon that has gone on for over 25 years. Time is allowed for those who watched Eva in their formative years when it was new to look at the film and its characters in a way that would be impossible otherwise. You can't just write a history with the audience. It has to be earned through the years. Seeing Toji and Hikari and even Kensuke having gone through the shit and seeing them no worse for wear and frankly in a better place than Rei, Asuka, and certainly Shinji just resonates so clearly and strongly because of that actual real history. I mean, Toji is a million miles away from being the kid that punched out Shinji for inadvertently landing his sister in the hospital.
There are lives you can't save. But I keep on going. I think it's the doctor's role to shoulder the sadness and anger that comes along with the losses.
And it shouldn't be lost on anyone that Kensuke, the literal otaku stand-in,
Miss Misato. Oh boy, am I envious. It must be nice living with a total hottie like her and to pilot an Evangelion.
Winds up being the one to tell Shinji that he needs to sort things out with his dad. Not by fighting him, but by talking to him.
Even if you think it's a waste of time, you should sit down and have a good talk with him. You'll regret it if you don't.
We're talking about Gendo Ikari.
And the fact that he also winds up being the one that helps Asuka realize that she's not as alone as she feels when the proverbial shit hits the fan is just the cherry on top of this surprising character arc. But the most surprising and simultaneously the best character arc has to go to Gendo's.
I thought a child was a punishment upon myself. Not meeting my child, not being there for him. I thought that would be redemption.
One of the reasons why I find the end of Evangelion to be as pessimistic and dour as I do is that for all that Gendo did in the series, he was still a person who, just like Shinji, didn't know what to do with the hurt he felt.
Now, Rei, be my guide and help me unite with Yui once again.
The show rarely goes into his side of things as a widower who clearly misses his wife. As such, he's mainly portrayed as a cold, indifferent, and sometimes cruel man who uses those around him for his own personal gain and goals. But we are privy to some intense personal moments of his. They just weren't as illuminating or as emotionally resonant as they could have been. So he's not really a sympathetic figure. We understand his motives, but there is no mistaking his intentions and actions as anything other than selfish and abusive. So the audience is primed for some kind of karmic punishment for him being selfish and abusive. But in a stunning reversal of the inlaid themes of actualizing your own agency in the show, the karmic punishment winds up happening outside of Shinji's agency. The only real catharsis to be found here as it relates to Eva's themes is that Rei rejects Gendo, closing him off from his plan and declaring herself her own person, with her own wants.
I cannot do that for you. I am not your doll.
Why?
Because I am not you. That's why.
We understand that as a clone, she wrestles with the notion of not even really being her own person with her own identity, and how those feelings reflect on the man that ostensibly created her. But her relationship with Gendo was never an outwardly adversarial one as it is with Shinji, nor was it ever a point of narrative focus as it is with Shinji. In fact, Rei's and Gendo's relationship reflects more positively on Gendo as a character, which further solidifies the animosity between Shinji and Gendo that unfortunately goes unfulfilled in the plot. Even when she does reject him, she just winds up taking her part in human instrumentality, just as Zila wants. So even her agency is kneecapped. It just seems that if Rei didn't reject Gendo, thus vicariously dooming him, Rei wouldn't have had an arc at all, unfocused and emotionally inert as it is. And we get this unsatisfying arc by not even letting Gendo and Shinji talk to each other. Bravo! After all the scenes of Shinji's angst about his father and their past, they don't even share the same screen with each other. No wonder his death feels as uninvolved and detached as it does. Was the audience supposed to cheer for the death? be sad about it or just react to it like they got an offer in the mail for a store they'll never go to. The only thing that the audience seemed to take away from Gendo in his death is that Gendo's a dick to Shinji. For the last 25 years, you couldn't separate Gendo, the character, from the jokes and memes involving him clowning on Shinji. Granted, this was helped along by the fact that Shinji was kind of an easy target, and everybody wants to be funny on the internet. But these jokes have been made for over 2 decades. If you were an anime fan from 1999 to 2019, you had to have seen a Gendo meme or made a Gendo meme. Hell, here's mine. I deserve the shame. So when You Cannot Advance started playing around with the idea that Gendo could have a face turn, it felt like it came out of left field, even though both it and You Are Not Alone had been planting the idea with Gendo's Walkman as a driving motif.
This used to be my dad's old cassette player.
Just like his old glasses you got, Ray.
He didn't need it anymore, so he got rid of it.
Just like me.
But the idea is quashed and the story returned to the status quo in a great bit of dramatic writing. Then, as You Cannot Redo and Thrice Upon a Time continue to build Gendo as this distant, unfeeling, even monstrous-looking villain, it seemed that Shinji would finally have his bout with his dad, chasing him into the literal anti-universe to have the conflict we were denied in End of Eva.
Hand over Unit 1 without delay. Then you, too, will be able to meet your mother again.
But it doesn't happen.
That's right. This is not something that can be resolved through might.
Yes, I want to talk to you.
Which, honestly speaking, was for the better. Not just because it's more emotionally fulfilling, but because, well, if there is an albatross across Thrice Upon a Time's neck, it's an aspect that's sadly shared with You Cannot Redo and even Love and Pop to some degree, and that's the direction and choreography of the action scenes. As the films move the setting up into space, and therefore a lot of the fight scenes, it allows Ono to indulge in his love of creating unusually angled shots and disruptive editing. But in doing so, I believe too much is lost when it comes to visual coherency and therefore fight scene storytelling. As an example of what I mean, the down-and-out best fight scene in all of Evangelion is Asuka's fight with Zila's angels in the end of Evangelion.
Did you actually think I'd lose? To amateurs like you!
It's more than just the fact that the scene itself is well animated on a technical level, it's that the animation is portraying a real sense of danger, effort, and the ebb and flow of a battle. Asuka goes from sheer jubilation and cockiness to wariness and exhaustion to outright desperation. The story told in this fight scene is a drama in of itself, told through gritted teeth and violence. It's a story that has a hero, villains, surprise twists, a false finish, and a tragic denouement. Best of all, this story isn't told. It's inferred. We know that Asuka has only a few minutes to fend off the angels, but her confidence assuages our fears. But as the battle continues and her labored movements are shown in prolonged wide shots of her heavy blows landing, we get a sense it's taking its toll. Asuka even informs the viewer to what she's experiencing with her body language and the film's use of editing. After taking care of an angel, her eyes dart to the next threat, which is coming from right above her, and the film cuts to her perspective to see an angel about to strike. We are in the proverbial trenches with Asuka in a gritty, visceral, exhausting battle. Meanwhile, in the third and fourth movies, at least in the first and second movies, the fight scenes take place on Earth, so Ono was forced to obey the laws of gravity, so to speak. But when up and down are meaningless concepts and the use of CG can make nearly anything happen, Ono indulges in what he believes will make for a visually dynamic shot. And just like in Love and Pop, this indulgence comes at the cost of annoyance. And sometimes even coherency. The look of both the Evas and the Nemesis series are so busy and over-designed that it feels kind of pointless to try and make sense of what you're even seeing, especially when they go into hand-to-hand combat. No bullshit, I got the exact same feeling watching some of these Eva fights as I did watching Michael Bay's Transformers. It's a detached mishmash of robots, pilots screaming, and general visual overload. And cue the meme.
It's so dense, every single image has so many things going on.
The typical fight scenes in the last half of the tetralogy usually involve unmanned dispensable drones overwhelming the Avas by sheer numbers, and the pilots have to swirl around and blast them with their guns or rip them apart with their bare hands. There's novelty in some of the fights, such as the opening fight scene in Thrice Upon a Time with Mari and her magnetically linked arms, but it still lacks weight and drama. There's just no story being told here, other than pilot goes... and then... I mean, really ask yourself, did we need Evangelion to follow every other shonen anime out there and have a remove the limiter even though it's dangerous fight mode?
Time for the last resort. I'm sorry, New Unit 2. I have to make rough for you. Disable all restrictors! Vector code 999!
Sure, the callouts and homages to Space Battleship Yamato are appreciated, but overall the presentation of the action scenes are, well, really uninvolving. Every time there was an action scene, I just kept wondering when we would get back to the characters, because the drama was a million times more compelling. And I think that was on purpose. I don't think Anno ever had an ending where Shinji vanquishes his father in some kind of overblown battle, even though there probably was a contingent of the audience that did. So when he baits and switches the audience by starting said battle only to pull the rug out once again and stop the fight, it feels like a pleasant surprise, and a welcome departure. Instead of another Eva fight, we get character growth.
I want to know now. To know you, Father.
An AT field.
It's practically an inverse of what happens in You Cannot Advance. A scene where Gendo is getting ready to sit down and talk with Shinji is interrupted by a reality-bending battle. Except here, it's a reality-bending battle that is interrupted by Gendo and Shinji getting ready to sit down and talk. And for the first time, Gendo is allowed to speak about his own thoughts and feelings about what he went through and why Yui meant so much to him. Unsurprisingly, Gendo reveals that he was very much like Shinji, and in the wake of Yui's disappearance, why he went so far to get her back.
Yui alone accepted me for who I was. After I lost Yui, I no longer had the confidence that I could live on being alone.
And of course, it doesn't work, because Yui wasn't inside Unit 1 or even in the anti-universe. She was inside Shinji.
I see. So that's where you were. Yui.
Personally, I'm glad the movie went this route, not just so that Gendo could have his personal closure, but for this one single solitary moment. A moment that has been 25 years in the making. 25 years of internet jokes, worst parent in anime polls, ironic t-shirts, and other outside ephemera, all cementing Gendo's legacy as the end-all to be-all poster child of the irredeemable bastard father in the minds of anime fans and even non-fans alike. Gendo just hugs Shinji and apologizes. In my life, I have never seen such a simple scene have so much history and weight behind it. It's not just that a father hugs his son and apologizes, it's who that father is. It's who that son is, and the long, long road it took to get to this point. It's nothing short of generational. And it's also the perfect keystone moment for what I believe the Rebuild movies are all about. Learning from your mistakes. The many but small moments of the cast mentioning that they've done this all before can be construed as a bit of a wink and a nudge to the audience because, after all, these are remakes. But for movie 1, where Kaoru wakes up in a line of coffins as if he were the latest Kaoru to do so, and throughout the subsequent films where he talks about doing this all before, you realize that, yes, they have done this all before.
The only thing that can end my existence is vacuum decay. That's why I have to repeatedly play a role in this predestined circular narrative for all of eternity.
The minute details are different, but the arcing themes are the same, the visual motifs are the same, the shots echo each other, character arcs are repeated, forcing them to relearn the same lesson. And now, teetering on the edge of creation within the anti-universe, the characters have gained cosmic awareness and realized that they are fictional. Again. Of course, this time, this awareness doesn't stop at personal fulfillment. As Shinji becomes aware of what has transpired before and what will most likely happen again, he wishes for a world without angels, Nerve, or even Evas. A world with a new beginning.
A world where new people can live.
Birth of a new world. Neon Genesis.
4 movies spread over 14 years, relearning the exact same lesson from 1997. Get out. Touch grass. The world is as good as you make it. Anno felt that he missed with Evangelion, that he wasn't able to give his audience the necessary jolt of inspiration to go out into the real world, which, to be fair, is not too surprising given the end of Evangelion, where the tone of the film feels more accusatory to the otaku audience rather than inviting or welcoming. An open hand is less threatening than a pointed finger.
You made a convenient fantasy to take revenge against reality.
What's wrong with that?
You were avoiding the truth by escaping into a fabricated world.
And as a message of letting go of the fantasy to make your way in the world, it can feel a bit backward that up until now, the Evas were used as a metaphor for growing up and facing whatever has kept you where you are. But in Thrice Upon a Time, this notion of keeping a separation between reality and fantasy feels less like an indictment on the audience and more a commonality that the audience might share with Gendo in the anti-universe.
Only humanity with its ability to believe equally in both fantasy and reality can perceive this Eva.
After all, who wouldn't be tempted in a reality where your will is paramount, where you can be as a god is, where you can finally have your real-life waifu? But the intent, all the same, is laid naked at the audience's feet as Shinji erases all remnants of Evas from the hearts of the many, releasing them of their bonds tied to Eva, and all he can do afterward is wait to disappear into the whiteness of a blank sheet of paper, until Mari manages to save him and pull him into the real world, where not only are they a couple, the rest of the children are there, all grown up and very much happy. If I had to describe Thrice Upon a Time and the rest of the tetralogy in one word, it would probably be confessional. Knowing what we do about Anno's life and work and how they've been intertwined for so long and so intimately, it's hard not to see his own growth as a person in his films. And as one of the few high-profile directors in anime whose life has been so carefully documented and expounded on by himself and those around him, it's almost as if we truly know the man. Seeing Shinji come out alright and far away from any kind of Eva, and knowing Anno is in a better place mentally and emotionally after completing the Rebuild movies, it feels like we even shared a bit in his own personal triumph. But remember how I said that a person's life isn't a Hollywood screenplay?
People can never fully understand others. Good luck even knowing yourself. It's impossible to truly grasp.
Chapter 9. Anno is not Shinji. In the months after the release of Thrice Upon a Time, Toshio Okada, you know, the guy who helped co-found Gainax but left to become an author and a lecturer under acrimonious circumstances, well, he penned an opinion article postulating a correlation between Mari and Moyoko Anno, possibly associating the two with their respective romantic partners. On the surface, it's not that much of a stretch to make the comparison, as it does seem to fit the narrative presented by both anime and real life. A woman comes into a troubled man's life and makes it better through her love and encouragement. It's a lovely story, despite being burdened by the tried and toxic notion of a woman coming in to solve a man's problems. Not to mention it runs completely against the anime's assertion that one's happiness is achieved through self-actualization. But more pertinent to this story is the fact that both Moyoko and Hideaki Anno could not disagree more. In the ensuing aftermath of said article, which has since been deleted, leaving only a blank page on a Japanese news site, the Annos struck down the comparison, with Hideaki going on the record that Mari was the brainchild of Tsuramaki. Several representatives from Kara also joined in on denouncing Okada's take in a video that has been taken off of YouTube, leaving Japanese fans remarking on the video and echoing what was said on Twitter. Apparently, Okada hasn't been in contact with Anno for decades, and hasn't even met Moyoko. So Okada had a bad take. It wouldn't be his first. But the immediate and swift backlash against the take was startling, to say the least. I suppose it comes down to the fact that it was because his wife was involved. Even if there was good intentions behind it, it's always best to leave the family out of your openly speculative article about a person's life, especially when said person is someone you have a rocky history with. But to be fair to Okada, it's not like Anno didn't engender this notion of an open invite into his private life. From articles to biographies and documentaries, Anno has a long and storied history of being pretty open about his problems in his life. And that's when he's not being too open.
あまり自分が好きになれないとなります。だからよく言われるのは自分が好きじゃない人っていうのは自分の理想が高いからだっていうのもよく言われるんですけど、なんかそれはそういう苦しみっていうのを分かってない人だと思いますよ。あんまり幸せって感じないんでね。確率的に低いんですよ。
The fact that he has put so much of his life and his own personality tics into his anime can't help to dissuade this notion either. It's not just Okada who thinks Anno is Shinji, even Anno's co-workers and staff echo the sentiment.
だってシンジ君なんか見てたらそうじゃない。迷える子羊、ストリシップ、まさにあれ。
And because there is this faux sense of familiarity about Anno and his life, combined with the popularity of his work, an entire community has sprouted up, dissecting every passage, preserving every tweet, and I don't think Anno is surprised. If I were to list up Otaku's characteristics, we're introverts with poor communication skills, unable to determine a suitable distance toward others. Our identity is supported by our store of information and knowledge. We're very obsessive, self-righteous, and cliquey for self-preservation, and can only talk about ourselves and suck at two-way communication. We're extremely self-conscious and can only look at things from our point of view. Love narcissists have a bloated sense of self that yearns to identify with our idols and are sensitive to attacks. Anno wrote this years after he went through what he did in the 90s, when his self-loathing was at its worst and the anime industry just ran roughshod over him. So it is fair to think that he was looking at the concept of an otaku with an appreciable distance, even if what he says isn't kind. I don't know how accurate his summation is, but I do feel this is a pretty accurate take from someone with a history of self-loathing. If you are of the position that you don't really like yourself, it would stand to reason that you wouldn't like the aspects you see in others that remind you of yourself. Anno has never denied his otaku-ness, so when he speaks on it, it may sound like he's talking about others, but he is also indirectly speaking about himself. Anno has made a lot of mistakes over his time working on Neon Genesis Evangelion, but perhaps his biggest mistake was thinking that just because he's an otaku means that other otaku must be like him. Anno might have been ready to examine and re-examine himself and look at all the parts that he felt he could work on to be a better, happier version of himself in 1995, but that kind of mentality has to be arrived at by the individual. Maybe he thought by sharing this notion he'd help others want to be ready too, but that's the danger of extending yourself as he did. When you reach out to people you have never met, you can pay a high price for being vulnerable. These days, Anno has adopted a more distant relationship with both the fans and the media. And who can blame him?
謎の人なんです。本当に謎です。きっと安野さんのことを本当に分かってる人って周りにどのくらいいらっしゃるんですかね。
Being who he is and in the business he is, it's difficult for Anno to completely detach himself from the public eye because there will always be people who want to know more. It's a delicate balance to maintain. Even when he's on the record, he makes it plainly clear that he is acting, so to speak, for the camera, even if it's for a documentary.
だからドキュメントなんてありえないっておっしゃってましたもんね。
まあそうですね。切り取りと編集が入った途端にもうそれはドキュメントではないですね。
Yeah, I think I'm just gonna click on this right here. It's not lost on me that by producing this, 3-hour-long series on Anno's life and work, that I do have a degree of culpability in contributing to this parasocial environment that surrounds Anno. Likewise, I am fully aware of Anno's less than charitable attitude toward people outside of the circle, so to speak, talking as if they were inside. But by diving into Evangelion in any of its forms, we dive into Anno and his life. There's just no separating the two from each other, not when he purposefully made Eva to include his interests, his dislikes, his past. The most responsible thing we can do with this information is to recognize the appropriate distance we should maintain with the man and his work, because we've seen what happens when others don't. I said at the top of this series that this was supposed to be a story about a man, but this story was not written by me, so much as it was interpreted by me. I tried my best to look for and read reputable sources, connect the dots with corroborating evidence, and lay it out for all of you to form what you will about Evangelion and Hideaki Anno. But his life? That was never for me to tell. That story is only for him to tell, and I dare say he has shown glimpses of what that would be on certain unfortunate occasions. But until he decides to make his own documentary, all we can do is try to understand and leave him alone.
It's impossible to truly grasp, and yet people are still compelled to learn everything they can about others and themselves. It's why you never get bored of life.
So, what story is for me to tell? Well, I guess mine. Chapter 10. 15 years. First, I want to say that this is going to be the personal part of the episode, so if you're only here for Evangelion, then I thank you for watching for as long as you did. This next part is probably not for you. With that said, I just want to end this video by talking a little bit about my work. I mean, this is supposed to be my 11th anniversary after all. I know it's 4 months late, but this is Evangelion we're talking about, so, you know, seems kind of appropriate. I can sense some of you out there are having a non-flashback, so to speak, to the last time I talked about Evangelion like 10 years ago, and don't worry, this is not going to be about baseball. In fact, I think we may even have something in common about that episode, because I don't like it either. Back when I made that episode in 2012, internet reviewing was a completely different animal then, and the in vogue thing to do was to be hyperbolic and to always go for the joke, and not always the honesty. And as the years have gone by, I've come to the realization that my lack of research and lack of honesty in that episode, as well as pretty much every other episode made before 2017, has poisoned my memory of them. That, as well as other mitigating circumstances. I understand that there is an entire cottage industry here on YouTube where YouTubers react to their old cringy videos, and I know it's pretty universal that no one likes their old stuff. And I also know that cringing is natural. It just means that you're no longer the person that you once were, and you cringing is just you reacting to that fact. It can be gratifying in a way, relatable even. You share a laugh at yourself and pat yourself on the back for not being that person anymore. But I want to make it clear that my attitude towards those old videos isn't that I find them cringy. My attitude is closer to something like genuine revulsion. And I also want to make it clear that if you like my old episodes on Evangelion, or any of my old episodes, then please feel free to do so. My attitude towards them should not influence your liking them, one way or the other. Just please understand that I'm no longer that same person. And that's not a bad thing. So, in my position, I felt like the only way that I could exercise some demons, as it were, was to revisit some anime that I could have done a way better job with. And with the release of Thrice Upon a Time, I just felt like Ava's time had come. Now, I know I said I was being dishonest in my 10-year-old Evangelion videos, but I think I should clarify what I meant. I wasn't being dishonest in the sense that I was lying about my thoughts and feelings towards Evangelion and its characters at the time. I was being dishonest with myself. And I think that reflected in what I said about the characters. I find the characters in Evangelion, and Shinji in particular, are a very, very good personality litmus test. You can't have a strong opinion on them, not without telling on yourself a little. And this is where I risk failing to heed the lesson that Anno learned. If it feels like I'm being obtuse, please understand that I'm just trying to explain myself while simultaneously keeping all of you at a respectful distance. Have you guys ever seen Bad Santa? You probably have, but just in case if you haven't, it's a pitch black comedy where Billy Bob Thornton plays a drunk mall Santa that hides in a kid's house so that way he can steal from a mall on Christmas Eve. Trust me, it's a lot funnier than it sounds. Anyway, the kid is a little weirdo and is constantly being bullied, but he takes a liking to Billy Bob and wants to show him his report card. And I have never seen anything in a movie that I relate to more.
I thought maybe at least since I did good in school, maybe you'd bring me a present. Even though I'm a dipshit loser.
When I say I relate to this scene a whole lot, it's pretty obvious I mean the kid. I'm sure that a lot of you out there can remember being like that. But it's more than just that. Billy Bob's character is constantly on the verge of drinking himself to death, and he knows precisely what the kid is going through. But instead of being sympathetic, he goes the opposite way.
Jesus fucking Christ, kid! Why do you talk about yourself that way?
It's not that he's angry at the kid or him for saying what he said. It's that he sees too much of himself in the kid in that moment. Self-loathing is a bitch like that. There's a lot more to that scene that I identify with, but I think you all get the important gist. So, 10 years removed from making those episodes on Ava, I was in a different place, I was a different person, and I was prepared to tackle Ava with everything I had. And then, some surreal things started happening to me. While I was doing my research on Anno, I found myself relating to him. I mean, I too was a kid who used to play pretend his favorite shows on the playground and watch too much television. I too was involved in making embarrassing low-budget fan movies that skirted by copyright law. And I know what it's like to be part of a company that I no longer have anything to do with. In fact, there's very little about Anno's life that I don't relate to in some way. But the more I related to Anno, the more I realized that it was harder for me to keep my personal biases in check. It became all too easy to see a pattern where there wasn't one. All too easy to spin the narrative towards something that I just simply hoped was true. When I realized this, I began to check myself and running my ideas through uninvolved third parties, all in the hopes of making myself sound like I wasn't trying to crack the case on Pepe Silvia. And then I had two different encounters that knocked me on my ass, completely unrelated to each other. I came across a young YouTuber on Twitter, and while I was aware of his work, he completely surprised me by saying that he was a fan of mine for a long time. The guy has already been on YouTube for years, but he's also in his early 20s, which means he started his YouTube career around the same age that I did. And when I figured that out, well, you see, even though I've been making Anime Abandoned for 11 years, if you all want to know the truth, I've been making videos for YouTube for 15 years this October. 15 years. The fact that a Gen Z YouTuber grew up watching my stuff and now he has his own successful YouTube channel makes me very, very proud. But it also makes me feel really, really old. And I'm only 32. Then, in the exact same month, another YouTuber seemingly came out of nowhere and punched a hole into my world by calling me a legend, that I'm one of the very, very few OG anime YouTubers still at it. And yeah, I guess I am. Mulling over what he said over and over again inside my head, I couldn't stop thinking about an anecdote that a country singer-songwriter once told about his relationship with Willie Nelson. According to him, Willie Nelson said, "If you fail at something long enough, you become a legend." Well, I don't feel like a legend. But I feel like I failed a lot. But what really killed me was who this YouTuber was. They have 15 times my audience. And they're the ones calling me a legend? Of course, I've since realized that this thought of mine wasn't born from some kind of misguided notion of flattery. It was born out of self loathing. I put this guy up on a pedestal because he gave me some validation for my work, and I thought I didn't deserve it. And then that's when I realized that I wasn't as far removed from who I was in 2012. Not as far as I had hoped, at least. Still wrestling with my self loathing. Still talking about Ava. The only thing that's really changed is that I'm older. It felt weirdly appropriate that I was going through all of this while I was working on an episode for Evangelion, art imitating life and all of that. Then again, 6 months spent researching, writing, filming, editing can get anyone in a weird headspace. I'm still trying to work my way through this, as I have been for a very, very long time. Maybe one day I could look at myself and be okay. Maybe it'll be tomorrow. Maybe. But even admitting all of this to you, and as true and as honest as these admissions are, it can't be denied that there's this wall between us. As Anno once said,
ドキュメンタリーってあるよって本当はない。結局使えるところだけ切り取るわけです。その時点でドキュメンタリーという名のフィクション。
And as I struggled with how I was going to wrap up all of my thoughts on such a macro topic as Neon Genesis Evangelion, I couldn't get that soundbite out of my head. On YouTube, if you're talking to the camera, it should feel real, authentic. The viewer should feel like they're having a conversation with the YouTuber. Except reality stops once I hit that record button on the camera. What you're watching isn't me. It's just a recording of me that's been carefully written and edited to achieve a facsimile of reality. A neat little narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It may seem callous to say, but that is our stock and trade here on the Internet Content Machine. Fostering this connection we have with people that we have never met. Without engagement, there is no sale. Hell, the whole reason I'm a YouTuber to begin with was because I was watching some of my favorite YouTubers all the way back from 2007, and I thought, wow, maybe I could be just like them. And I was sold. So, what can I do to wrap up this 11th anniversary of Anime Abandon? Well, I suppose I should be what I wasn't the last time I talked about Evangelion. Honest. Or as honest as I can be in this version of reality. What I took from Ava is that despite your happiness not being entirely up to you, you can't be happy, not without realizing your own effort to be happy. It's a mistake to think that self-hatred only hurts the self, and that despite the truth hurting, not everything that hurts is true. You are your own person, no matter how much you can see yourself in others, and no matter how much you may want to. You are not shit.